How do you keep something secret? You hide it in plain sight.
There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
I said, well, you're going to tell the public about it. And he says, no, we don't tell the public about this. It would panic the public.
And you know, there's a new name. It's unexplained aerial phenomenon.
I'm a doctor in an ER taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks. And I'm being asked to brief the CIA director on stuff because he and the president are being lied to? What?
And he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And I said, whose?
If the average person knew that the term UFO was actually concocted after they knew that they were extraterrestrial vehicles or man-made anti-gravity devices, they would realize that for 60 years we've already had the solution to the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, and global poverty. The most dangerous thing going on the planet today isn't ISIS, it's not Iraq, it's not Russia, it's not China. It's a out-of-control, covert group that is not being overseen by the people, the Congress, or the president, who have developed these technologies and are recklessly using them to track and target extraterrestrial vehicles. The result of this is that we're in a crisis that is unacknowledged, ironically, because these projects are unacknowledged.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There is no threat, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space.
So either they don't exist, but if they are, they're a threat. So this is the 1-2 punch that's been going on, unfortunately, for 60-some years. He said, do you know why they killed Marilyn?
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
And I said, well, I didn't until I got this document. It's a virtual death warrant.
When they found out that Tesla had passed away, they came in, they had the manager of the hotel open the safe, and they took all of Tesla's papers.
Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's an urban myth or a conspiracy theory. I say, like the hell it is. This is like a bad, conspiracy novel, except this became my life. I'm Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'm the director of the Disclosure Project and CSETI and SeriousDisclosure.com and the Orion Project. These projects I'll explain very briefly in a moment. The purpose of this seminar today is really to go in depth and share things I have not shared publicly about how disclosure has happened, because it has happened and is happening, and what the process was that led up to that. But I first want to thank you guys for coming here and having the interest, because it's the public that has actually made disclosure happen from the beginning. Although it was requested by some folks at the CIA, which we'll get into, it's the public that's really enabled it, including all the now 550 top secret military and corporate witnesses that have come forward. Now, I want to state that at this point, the numbers are continuing to grow. And most of those witnesses are people who've been in the intelligence community or Department of Defense, some branch of the armed forces, or corporations that deal with so-called unacknowledged special access projects, super secret projects that deal with UFOs. And only about 1/5 of them have consented to be filmed and have their persons identified to the public. The reason for that is fear and concern for their own privacy and concerns over some issues that I don't think we need to worry about at this point around the legalities. And we'll get into this over the course of the day. And the main purpose of the Disclosure Project was really to educate the public that we're not alone in the universe and that this has been known by highly classified projects for 70 years and that those projects have, unfortunately, become illegal and unconstitutional operations that operate transnationally. Note that I said transnationally, not internationally. The secrecy that surrounds this issue is so extraordinary that most presidents are not briefed on it, and if they're briefed in a way that is perfunctory and very, very limited and designed to control their actions. For example, Ronald Reagan was provided some information, but only insofar as it was false, so that he would support SDI, the Star Wars missile defense program, so that he could justify the spending. But for the most part, presidents since Eisenhower have not had appropriate access control. Now, what I mean access control, this means not only access to the program, but control over them. And people need to make at the very beginning, a very clear understanding between knowing and being able to do anything about it. So every single president has been interested in this. Famously, Jimmy Carter, as he was the president-elect, was asked the outgoing CIA director, George Bush Sr., to brief him on this issue because he had had a sighting. Some of you may know this while he was governor of Georgia. I have that report. And President-elect Carter was told by then outgoing CIA Director Bush that he would not tell him about this issue, and he didn't say he didn't have information. He said, "I will not share that with you," and directed him to get it from the Congressional Research Service. Believe it or not, saying that to the incoming President of the United States. And this is well documented in Disclosure Project witness testimony from people who were privy to what happened. And I think that this is why folks have to understand that just because that someone is the president or the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or for that matter, the head of the CIA, does not mean that they're going to even know about these operations. Now, when I first started out on this, it was an accident of what my real initial love was, and that is peaceful interstellar contact. I started out doing what I'm doing, while I was working full-time as an emergency and trauma doctor in North Carolina, because I thought it was time for humans to show a different face to the cosmos. One that wasn't militaristic, one that wasn't xenophobic, one that wasn't fearful, but one that was hopeful and forward-looking. And so I founded the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence 25 years ago, in CSETI, to do exactly that. And so we set upon this project, sort of just grassroots, and right away, within a year or two, we had contact. All of you know what happened near Pensacola, where we were out on a beach with about 50 people. A couple of them were Air Force pilots, a colonel and another guy. And there were 4 ET craft that materialized and vectored in and was filmed. Very poor film footage, old high-8, no night scopes, but it was actually quite close. This ended up on the front page of the Pensacola paper the next day. And that at that point, what I was doing got put on the radar scope of the national security state of folks dealing with this. This is the part of the story most people don't understand. I never intended to be involved with this aspect of it, because what I really wanted to do was create a grassroots movement that basically bypassed the US government or any other government to make contact with these civilizations as citizen diplomats. much like Physicians for Social Responsibility were citizen diplomats to the Soviet Union during the coldest days of the Cold War, darkest days of the Cold War, but on an interplanetary, interstellar level. Unfortunately, I got diverted, not stopped from doing that other project, the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, which is when humans go out and intentionally make contact. But I was pulled into what I'm doing now with Disclosure Project because I was asked to. So within a month of that event in Florida in March of 1992, I was asked to go to a conference in Atlanta. Now, I thought it was just a conference. I got there and it was half of MAGIC, this covert group that deals with UFOs there. The former head of Army intelligence was there, there were NSA people there were DIA people there, et cetera and so on. And they proceeded to sort of ask me, what the hell do you think you're doing? I said, well, I'm doing what you can read. It's all public. I don't have any secrets about it. We're a team to make contact with these civilizations outside of governmental channels because the government is broken. And I was informed it was none of my business and not to do it. And I said, try stopping me. So we kind of had a mano, was not pretty, till 3 in the morning in a hotel room. And, and I said, this is what I'm going to do. So there were people opposed to what the CE5 contact program was from the very, very earliest days. Most people don't realize that. On the other hand, there's a senior official at the CIA who flew down on a jet to my town in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, to say, do it, and don't give up. Someone's got to do this because it's completely out of control, and moreover, someone's going to have to spearhead not only making contact, but informing the public, because the system is so completely dysfunctional. Now, the person who was sent down was a man whose family founded the California Institute of Technology, one of the most prestigious universities in America, and is associated with the NSA and CIA. And I said, well, I'm a country doctor in North Carolina, rambling around in an ER, and I'm doing this sort of as just an ad hoc group to do this. He says, no, well, someone is going to have to do this, but also is going to have to educate the public. And I said, well, I'll do what I can in between ER shifts and raising 4 children. And as things went, that was sort of the initiation, and my initiation into this sort of weird, down the rabbit hole world of secret projects. I'm going, why is this guy coming as an emissary of this very senior CIA person who's involved in this, begging me to do something? Why don't they just do it? Anyway, so you're going to see this leitmotif repeated over and over again over the course of today. And at that point, I said, okay, well, I will do what I can. And a few months later, there was a man named Bill Clinton, got elected to the presidency of the United States. And I was immediately approached by people who were friends of his, and who said, well, this is something that he's very interested in. And it's well known that his good friend Webster Hubbell, who was third in command at Justice Department prior to being convicted of some other problems, said that Bill Clinton asked that he wanted to know about 2 things. Who really killed Marilyn Monroe? Because he had a fascination with Marilyn Monroe. And who killed Jack Kennedy? And also, what is this UFO stuff? Is there anything really to it? So he made a directed inquiry, and as Webster Hubbell reported in his book, Friends in High Places, this is not, you can read it and see, they made inquiries into the subject, and they, quote, were not happy with the answers they were getting, which is a polite way of saying they know they were being lied to. Well, at about that time, and a little bit before some of the Clinton folks approached me, some military people who were friendly to disclosure approached me, who had had experiences either on battleships or at strategic air command facilities where nuclear facilities are hosted, and said, you know, I'll do anything I can to help you. And one of these men was a naval commander who was very connected up in the Pentagon. And he showed up at my door, basically, at my home. And I thought initially he was a spook, a spy. And I said, well, this spook is probably here to disrupt my project. And it turns out he was a totally stand-up guy who did everything he could to set up a number of the meetings you're going to hear about behind the scenes in deep background briefings that I did at the Pentagon subsequently. And we decided to have a meeting. I was invited by a former State Department person to have a meeting at the Monroe Institute, which is ironically about 10 minutes from where my country home is now in Virginia, to discuss how to put together a team of people to brief the correct folks in government and encourage them to end the secrecy. Now, you have to understand this is 1992, 93. 22 years ago, 21 years ago, I was in my 30s, a bit naive about how government worked. I actually thought we had a functional constitutional government. I have since learned we do not. That's all window dressing. That's all the Truman Show, like the movie The Truman Show, where it's all sort of a fake. And that there's a parallel governmental process that runs this and other important issues that are completely out of the reach of the people we elect and appoint. But at that time, so we had this meeting, and it was decided that we should contact certain key people in the U.S. government to, in military speak, deconflict the CSETI contact teams from Air Force and other military operations so that they didn't interfere with us and we didn't interfere with them. That was the purpose of it, was to deconflict that, because we didn't want interference from those guys with what we were doing, which we were getting a lot of interference. We were getting helicopters, jets, all kinds of stuff coming in to our contact sites, and we still do to this day, which have been filmed and documented. So unfortunately, we said this is something that is really critical if we're going to make contact and not have it become something where something terrible happens accidentally. Okay, so my military advisor who came forward said, let's see what I can do and run this up the flagpole, as they say. And so he knew the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an admiral, who, Admiral Kramer with a C, C-R-A-M-E-R. And he went in, had a meeting, and said, look, we really need to have a meeting with the Air Force intel people at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, to which the Roswell remains were sent, and which still had what was called the National Air Intelligence Center, and then it became the Foreign Aerospace Technology Center. It was always FTD, Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force, back in the 40s and 50s. It's gone through many name changes. It's the same facility at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And he said, okay, let's see if you can set up a meeting. And the admiral, now this is the head of intelligence, Joint Chiefs of Staff, pushed back from the desk and said, are you serious about UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence? And the commander, military commander, who was volunteering to help us, said, yes, we're very serious. And so the admiral said, okay, I'll do it. So they refused to take the meeting. Now, so what happened is that J2, what's called J2, head of intelligence joint staff, called the head of Air Force intelligence and said, you will make this meeting happen. And Dr. Greer will be received there because they have something to discuss with those folks. And that was now the fall, September 1993. Okay, so that meeting was set up. Now, in the meanwhile, some folks working with Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the UN Secretary General at the time, and Lawrence Rockefeller, who was the scion of the Rockefeller family, who was the philosopher king of the family. I mean, David Rockefeller was sort of the money guy with Chase Manhattan, which became J.P. Morgan Chase. And his nephew, Jay Rockefeller, was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And Nelson Rockefeller, who had passed away, who had been vice president, ironically, was his brother, who had set up the Rockefeller Commission of 1956 that completely reorganized the Department of Defense and the CIA so no U.S. president could contain or control or penetrate UFO projects. So the Rockefeller family was up to their eyeballs in this. Lawrence knew that, but he was on the side of the angels. He wanted to sort of cleanse the karma, as it were, I believe, of that family and actually help. So a lot of people have, of course, attacked me for knowing a Rockefeller as proof that I'm sort of part of some cabal. I said, no, they contacted me because Lawrence knew that what we were doing was really novel and was effective because he had sent people, it turned out, to some of our events where we had had contact, where we did the CE5 protocols and E.T. Craft would appear and then disappear. He went, he took this information back to Lawrence and said, this is no joke. So Lawrence Rockefeller invited me up to New York and then invited me to his ranch, the JY Ranch in Wyoming. And as you know, that's where the Clintons, for the first couple years of their presidency, would vacation in August. But I was asked to go there in September of 1993 to basically share what he thought would just be the information about the CE5 initiative. Lawrence Rockefeller did not know about the initiative to brief senior governmental officials and encourage them to end the secrecy, which had started a few months prior to that at this meeting in Virginia at the Monroe Institute with a select number of folks that my military advisors had gathered together that was July of '93. So he just thought it was going to be a discussion about the protocols of the CE5 initiative, remote viewing, making contact, interstellar diplomacy, all of these concepts. And so we decided that it was really time for us to go ahead and have some meetings like this with Lawrence. And I said, okay, I'll go because I have to go out. I'm on a trip anyway, taking time off from my medical work in the ER to go to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which also Lawrence knew nothing about. Lawrence Rockefeller knew nothing about. So here's what happened. I was going to go to the Rockefeller Ranch just as sort of a guest to share this. And during the course of a sort of a round table, and there were all kinds of people there. Robert Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace, who's a billionaire, was there. A whole bunch of people who of various backgrounds in the UFO subculture, some friendly to what we do and some incredibly unfriendly, who we found out were working for the intelligence community, were there. And there was this gathering at this famous Rockefeller Ranch in the Grand Tetons. So one day it came up what else I was working on. I said, well, we've initiated a project to brief senior government officials in the Clinton administration and the Pentagon and members of Congress so that we can terminate secrecy on this issue and get the government to change policy, because we understand that the incoming president is favorable to that idea, which was, of course, Bill Clinton. And as a result, you could have heard a pin drop in the room. Nobody knew at all. And the first thing Lawrence Rockefeller said, what, it was like this. Where are you doing? I said, well, I'm going straight to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base after this meeting to brief the colonel over this Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force. And then I'm going to, in a couple months, brief President Clinton's CIA director. So at this point, Lawrence Rockefeller and everyone there were in a state of shock. Now, that initiated what has been incorrectly called the Rockefeller Initiative. There was no Rockefeller Initiative. Let me explain that in a moment. What it was an initiative because he found out what we were doing, and his people said, you've got to get involved with this. So Lawrence wanted to play a behind-the-scenes role, and that's why he was willing to host the President and First Lady at the ranch to provide what we put together, which was called the Best Available Evidence, which is the collection of best cases, best photos, best government documents we had that were extant at that time in 1993. So the President was invited out in the following summers, 2 summers, to the Rockefeller Ranch for that purpose. And the UN Secretary General, in the meanwhile, and his wife came to some meetings in what are called salons. A salon is when someone hosts a very nice meeting in a private home with dignitaries, and you have a guest, usually some surprise guest or some interesting character like me, to come in and inform the New York 100 about what's going on. So that's what I did, and they were incredibly successful. Subsequent to that, Mrs. Boutros-Ghali invited us to have a meeting at the UN so I could brief a lot of the diplomats and friends of hers in the UN who were supportive of ending secrecy and making peaceful interplanetary contact. And actually, Leah Ghali herself hosted that for me at the United Nations. I'm just trying to give you sort of a sense of what happened before May of 2001 with what's now very famous National Press Club event. So this was all going on with the idea that if we were to provide the correct information to the President and to his advisors and to members of Congress, the key people in Congress, they would do the right thing and would disclose this information because the Cold War had ended, and we thought, here's a fig leaf to put on the secrecy, even though it's a bit of a misdirect, but politicians always need to have a cover. CYA, Washington's all about cover your ass. So to explain 40 years of secrecy, they could have said, well, during the Cold War tensions, we didn't want to throw into that mix the fact that we're being visited by interstellar civilizations, and with also a program to study what their technologies are. And now that the Cold War is over, we can come clean. So I was recommending that they use that as an excuse for the chicanery that had gone on between 1956 and 1990s, 40 years. Well, it was an interesting thing that happened. In the fall of 1993, I was given a lecture at the Colorado State University, hosted by astronaut Brian O'Leary and Maury Albertson, who was one of the co-founders of the Peace Corps. And they became very, very close friends and supporters of what we were doing. And in that presentation, I laid out the entire sort of manifesto of justifying disclosure, ending secrecy, and what we should do. And at the end of that talk, and I don't know, there were maybe 800 people there, 1,000, something like that. There was a man, a little bald man, standing at the back of the room. And he wouldn't leave, and he waited till almost everyone was gone. He came up to me and he said, Dr. Greer, I think I can help you with this. I know some folks in Washington who want to know about this, but they're not getting any good answers. I said, well, like who? And I thought he was going to say, staffers for Congressman blah blah from Nowhereville, Montana. And he said, well, I'm very good friends with the Director of Central Intelligence, the CIA director, and he would like to be briefed on this. And of course I said, well, that's a good start. So initially that meeting was set up for November of 1993, and it got pushed back because of scheduling conflicts that he had and I had to December 13th, 1993. My wife, Emily, was there with me. And the cover story was a dinner party just here in Arlington at this man's home, and with his CI director and with his the CI director's wife, Dr. Sue Woolsey, who was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences. So, which is very good because I feel, well, we can get two birds with one stone here because she's a very senior scientist in a very prestigious institution. So again, we got a nanny for the kids, flew up to Washington, had this meeting. Now, normally when you meet with someone at cabinet level, it's a, very tight, maybe 20 minutes, 15, 30. This went on for about 3 hours. And the initial part of it, I had this whole briefcase and portfolio full of all these images of photographs and documents and cases and all this stuff. And after about 10 minutes, the CIA director said, okay, I know this. We know that they exist. And it turns out he and his wife had had a sighting in New Hampshire when they were younger. I want to know, and this is the key question to answer, why won't they tell me and the president about it? I'm the CIA director. I said, well, that's another discussion. And at first, I got some hint of this when I got the letter, which I have in my archives, because subsequently, Woolsey tried to backpedal and say this briefing never happened. He publicly said so, and I can prove it to be a lie. I always say in Washington, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. Lips are moving, that means they're lying. So, ouch. Did I just say that? Yeah, I did. It's on the record. There you go. So, but the letter I got describing the briefing from our host said that you're going to be the first person to brief the president's people and his CIA director on this issue because they've asked questions and they can't get anything through channels. Now, at that point, I have to say, I thought I was being Zoomed. I really thought this was a prevarication and that this spy master, the CIA director, just wanted to pick my brain, find out what we were doing with folks like the Rockefellers and da-da-da. And it turned out he 100% was out of the loop. He knew nothing about these projects, and he was being completely deceived by those who had compartmented intelligence within the agency, the CIA, and he literally was the emperor that had no clothes, and so was the president. So it was at that point, on December 13th, 1993, that I realized that we were living in a country that had undergone a quiet coup d'etat decades earlier. That isn't talked about in the New York Times and Washington Post because it would be the biggest story ever and the biggest scandal ever. They'd rather talk about the blue stain on a dress and other trivialities, or the stain on a blue dress, and rather than talking about the truth. And we, at that point, had put together a white paper, which is in my first book about extraterrestrial intelligence, which you can get on our website at seriousdisclosure.com. And it describes basically the plan of what needed to be done by the chief executive, the president and his people, to end the secrecy. So I had that in my hands, and I was giving it to the CIA director as he was leaving. And he looked at me and he said, how can we disclose that which we have no access to? Very chilling question. So, in other words, if we were to push on this, then it would unveil the biggest constitutional crisis in the United States history. And no president wants to admit that they're out of the loop on important things. No one wants to admit that. Therefore, he said, we will do what we can do. I'll continue to look into this. Please continue to send any information you have to me through this contact. But we'll have to see what the president can do. That meeting, as I said, was about 3 hours. Most of it was talking about contact, the technologies, why secrecy would be as extreme as it is. And this is, the why of secrecy is much more difficult for people to get their minds around than the how. So let me first do the how. Everyone thinks there's something called above top secret. Well, in the United States government, most governments, there's no such thing. There's actually confidential, secret, and top secret. But then within these classifications, there are compartments. So you have TSSCI, top secret special compartmented intelligence. So TSSCI, it's the compartment you're in that matters. Some compartments, like what Edward Snowden exposed about PRISM, was a compartment that the president and the oversight committees of the Congress knew about. However misguided they may have been, they were legally overseeing compartments, which is why he's in trouble. There are other compartments that are unacknowledged special access projects. Special access projects require these clearances, and the unacknowledged ones mean exactly that. They are acknowledged to no one outside the compartment. And that includes the President of the United States or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or whoever. So one of the big mistakes that people make is conflating people's position in the military, the CIA, Congress, the presidency, the White House, the National Security Council, the whole alphabet soup of government agencies with access, all access, just because they have a top secret clearance, to every compartment. And I know men who are in one compartment and or in one section, and they have a friend that's in another compartment, and they both have top secret clearances, very high compartments, and they do not know what each other's working on. They may be best friends and they won't know. And that is how it works. But the unacknowledged special access projects mean that they're not acknowledged. And this is what Rumsfeld meant the day before 9/11. If you look at the film Sirius, when he said there's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for in the Department of Defense budget over the last few years. Not billion, trillion. Now it's at least 5 trillion. And now this is no flaming liberal. This is Donald Rumsfeld, okay, who dragged us into this misadventure called the Iraq War, along with Dick Cheney and some other neocons who didn't understand the Middle East, obviously, or anything else for that matter, dealing with world politics. And so, but he literally said that. I don't know if he knew it was being filmed, but it was, and we got it, and it's in the film Sirius. So what does that mean? $2.3 trillion unaccounted for. It means that there is no accounting. I know an auditor who audits my uncle's old company, was Northrop Grumman, which does a lot of top secret work on certain kinds of aircraft, just like Lockheed Martin has certain contracts dealing with anti-gravity propulsion craft. And if it's an unacknowledged compartment and it has some billions of dollars in it, the auditor will be told, you don't have a need to know what's going on with this, and it is just rubber stamped as an audit. They have no idea where that money's going. It goes in the front door. Where it's going through the back door, God only knows. All right? We estimate between $100 and $200 billion every year is going into the unacknowledged government. And this is a conservative estimate, unacknowledged. Congress doesn't know where it's going. The president doesn't know where it's going. A lot of senior military people don't know how it's being used and where it's going. My military advisor for 20 years was in one project that was a $3 billion unacknowledged special access project. The admiral that he was working under, where they basically went into a SCIF, a secure communication intelligence facility underground. Everyone's weapons were taken, everyone's cell phones, watches, anything electronic taken. One man went down there with them with a gun. And the gun was the security enforcement officer for that USAP, Unacknowledged Special Access Project, USAP. And they were all told, the guy took a bullet out of the chamber, and they said, if you tell anyone about anything going on in this unacknowledged project, there is a bullet with your name on it, and it will find you somewhere, somehow. Now, this is not a movie. This is actually how that world works. That's the world I've lived in since 1993, or been exposed to. And so that is serious stuff, and they mean it. And so my military advisor said, oh, absolutely, this is no John le Carre novel or John Grisham story. This is really how the unacknowledged super black world operates. Now, of all the projects that are unacknowledged, black bag operations of all kinds, special operations of all kinds, the blackest and the most unacknowledged are ones dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, by far. And so that's why when you read the document from early 1950s from Canada, the Wilbur Smith document, where he says, after talking to someone in the United States government, this is a Canadian top secret document that got declassified accidentally. It's on our website. And he says this subject is the most secret subject in the United States and exceeds the secrecy surrounding the development of the hydrogen bomb. At that point, we hadn't detonated a hydrogen bomb. Imagine something more secret than the ultimate doomsday weapon. Not an atomic bomb, a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb, which is what we were working on in '51. So the thing I point out to folks is that these sort of operations have gotten so out of control that that's why Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex when he left office in 1961, just before Jack Kennedy took office. And Eisenhower, on his watch, and he was bitter about this to the very end, Jackie Gleason, a famous comedian, his wife told our team that Jackie Gleason and Eisenhower were good friends, that Gleason was bitter about this and heartbroken about this to the day he died, that he had lost control over these UFO projects. And that happened between 1956 and 1961. Now, why did this extreme, so this gives you an idea of how unacknowledged special access projects work. They're hermetically sealed silos, and no one outside that compartment, that matter your position in government, doesn't matter your clearance, will know what you're doing in it. So wrap your mind around that. That is how these projects are managed. And we're talking an almost limited amount of money they can use in access to enforce this and run those projects. Is it legal? No. Is it dangerous? Yes, because it is, by definition, completely without oversight of the people, the people's representatives, or the president, or for that matter, the senior folks at the Pentagon. I'll get to this in a moment. So at this point, I'm reeling. I'm just sort of like, I'm absorbing all this. Look, I'm a country doctor in North Carolina, rambling around in an ER, taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and burns and what have you. And this bag of crap gets handed off to me. And I think, well, you know, this is way past my pay grade. I'm just... And in January or early February 1994, a friend of the president's comes to our home, a man that I had met sometime earlier. And name is Kevin Foley. This is years enough gone, I'll go share his name. And his brother would stay overnight at the White House a lot and have breakfast with the president. He was a big fundraiser for President Clinton. From Minnesota, Foley family, very well-known political family. And I'd gone up there and met with his family and what have you, and he came back to my home and he said, well, we were having dinner around the table and we in this house and we had in North Carolina, and he turns to me and he says, well, the president and his folks really are very supportive of what you're recommending in this white paper, this set of recommendations I'd given the CIA director. But they're concerned that if he does this, he'll end up like Jack Kennedy. And I start laughing. I think, well, I think he's joking. I mean, this is ridiculous. And he stops me. And because he was sort of a big, kind of heavy-set, jolly, sort of gregarious political operative, you know. And I just thought he was making a joke. Like if I tell you I have to kill you, sort of cliche. And he stopped me and he says, no, they're not kidding. I said, well, Kevin, don't talk about this in front of the children. The children were small then. And I said, we need to, talk in the library after dinner about this. So we went to the library after dinner to talk about this issue. And I was very, very concerned that this could even be on the radar of anyone at the White House. And he says, yes, absolutely. The president is convinced, and his people are convinced, that if he were to push on this issue, that he would be subject to a TWEEP, a termination with extreme prejudice. TWEP, TWEEP. And I said, well, then what do you want me to do? I mean, look, I mean, it's not like I've got a Secret Service detail. And he said, well, no, they think you can do this. You should go ahead and try to bring this stuff together and bring it. I said, oh, yes. I said, I'm expendable. He says, yes. I said, doesn't matter if I get killed, you can't risk the president. He said, that's right, you are expendable. So from then, I always call myself the throwaway guy. Doesn't matter if I get killed, you know, because I'm nobody, and I remain nobody. So, and I want to be a nobody in terms of politics and conventional power. So I'm very happy to be a nobody. So what, I use that term in the sense of how Washington thinks, the currency of power. And I said, well, I'll do what I can, but, you know, this is a very steep climb. So by 1994, and it was later confirmed to us later in 94 and 95, that when Rockefeller hosted the Clintons, and there's that famous picture of Hillary Clinton holding the book about extraterrestrial intelligence at the Rockefeller Ranch when they were visiting out there. You know, yeah. Okay, so she actually is the one who stood up and stopped the briefing and said it's too dangerous. We don't want. We're not going to pursue this. And ultimately, politicians are going to put their finger in the air and they're going to see which way the winds are blowing and see what they can benefit from. They saw this as a lose-lose situation. In other words, it was a situation where if they were to push on this, they would be stepping on some very big toes. Very, very big toes. How big? Several $100 trillion of world economic activity. Now let me back this up now. So the how is hard for some people to wrap their mind around when it comes to this kind of secrecy, but the why is the pièce de résistance. Because if you look at what these projects that are unacknowledged special access projects are doing, what they really have been doing has been trying to acquire, as this top secret Canadian document, the Wilbur-Smith document in 1951 states, the modus operandi, the mechanism of action of these extraterrestrial vehicles, meaning the technology, the science and technology. Because if you're interstellar, you're not using Exxon Jet A fuel. You're not using a rocket like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic is using. You're not using something like the space shuttle. You're using some technologies that are the trans-dimensional end of physics, very high energy electromagnetic field propulsion systems that allow you to drop out of 3D space and appear at another point in space by going through other dimensions. Okay? Now, you can do that without going trans-dimensional by just creating energy from the so-called zero-point field and creating an anti-gravity effect, so you have lifters so that you can go 100,000 miles per hour, make a right-hand turn with no deceleration effect because you created a bubble in space-time that corrects for one gravity. That's what a lot of the, quote, UFOs are that people see being test flown out near Nellis and the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, and et cetera and so on. We mastered gravity control October 1954. I was not a twinkle in my father's eye. Most of you weren't born at that point. I wasn't. And that is when we mastered gravity control. How do I know this? The third highest ranking official at the Naval Research Labs, the largest defense lab for the Department of Defense here in Washington, has been a friend for years, and he was in the vault and saw the documentation for this, unredacted, because it's all the original documents, and that was the date. So we have not needed jet engines, rockets, oil, gas, public utilities, surface roads, think about this, steamships, internal combustion engines of any sort, for at least 60 years. And if you really go back to the earlier part of the century, we're just plain free energy from Tesla type things, 100 years. But you're stepping on a stockpile of money and commodities and mineral wealth being traded, oil, coal, other uranium, that's worth, in the aggregate, several $100 trillion. The US federal budget is $3 or $4 trillion. And if you take out entitlements and things that are mandatory, it's a fraction of that. So it's the tail is wagging the dog here. So the financial interest, the petrodollar interest, the big commodity trading firms like Goldman Sachs, and the big money folks, that's where the action is. And those are the masters, not the president, not the Congress, not the UN Secretary General, certainly, not the Prime Minister of England, etc. So let's just pull the mask off and just admit that we're living in a period of petro-oligarchs, kleptocrats, klepto meaning theft, like a kleptomaniac, kleptocrats, and that this sort of myth of free markets and a free society and an open and free democracy is just a myth. Because our democracy was hijacked decades ago. Now, on trivial issues like the marginal tax rate or whether you're going to raise or lower payments for Social Security, the President and Congress can fight about that, and it's sort of this show going on, a whirling dervish show of nonsense that goes on. On these issues, they don't want those clowns, is how they view it, dealing with it. So this permanent, unacknowledged covert program has put a lead ceiling in. And only rarely does anything bubble up from there, or down, I should say, to the body politic out of these unacknowledged special access projects. So it became my task to find out how to do that and live to see the next day, all right? Because it doesn't do me any good if I do it recklessly and I'm dead. You can't do anything if you're dead. Well, you can, but it's different. So you're doing other things. So this became the central issue. And Lawrence Rockefeller, I suggested, look, we need to then, if the president will not do this, we need to get together a group of people, put together this best available evidence, and also assemble top secret folks who will have the courage to provide credible documentation, testimony about what they've known. So I suggested and organized a meeting at Asilomar facility near Monterey, California, in June of 1995. Edgar Mitchell was there with me, Marina Popovich, who was a very renowned cosmonaut in the Soviet Union, some KGB officers were there, and some of the early Disclosure Project witnesses were there. Now this is 95, this is 20 years ago. And Lawrence paid for it, and Lawrence Rockefeller said, look, I will totally support doing this. And when I was with him at the ranch, I said, well, why don't you take a public leadership in this? And I was talking to him out on his deck with the beautiful Remington Native American sculpture that's, with the Native American on horseback, the very famous. Of course, they have the original of everything. And I said, I need your help. He says, oh no, it's too dangerous for me. He says, there are members of my family already jumping up and down on my feet that I'm doing this much. And I knew he was talking about he was talking about, the money people in his family. He was the philanthropic guy who just wanted to give away his wealth before he died. That was his whole purpose. Really sweet man. And so I said, well, okay, I told him, you're old, you're rich, and you're a Rockefeller. I'm a nobody. I'm a North Carolina doctor who's trying to do this with no resources. He says, I'll be behind the scenes. And he took his old hands and did this, and he said, it's like a flock of geese. We're all flying together. I'll be back here. and you need to be here. I said, well, yeah, but that head goose gets all the head. They take turns. He said, no, you be up here. It was very comical. I said, oy vey, this is like, I said, okay, that's what we'll do then. And he wanted to just stay behind the scenes, but he was provide that support, hosted the Clintons. So we had something called Project Starlight that formed before the briefing of the CIA director. That was the code name for what became the Disclosure Project that all of you know about. And Project Starlight, with the AP, the Associated Press sued the Clinton Library and got those documents. Those documents are in my first book. And at Asilomar, we had all these dignitaries, including Kevin Foley and astronaut Edgar Mitchell and Maureen Povovich, and all these folks sign a letter to the President of the United States recommending ending the secrecy. It's in my first book. Buy it, get it, see it, read it. And that, however, was the Associated Press a couple years ago sued the Clinton Library and got those documents, and they put them out on the internet. Now, at this point, we knew by '95, the president, with all the cajoling we could do, with all the work Lawrence was doing behind the scene, hosting Bill and Hillary at the JY Ranch for their vacations. A very good friend of the president's, I don't want to name her, but used to live at the White House and very good friends with Hillary, said that Hillary did not want to deal with this at all, but Bill was so interested in it, he would pull out the best available evidence briefing packet that we put together, and we'd be sitting in the private quarters of the White House going through it. And she's this hilarious woman who did a perfect imitation of Bill Clinton. And he said one time they put it out on the floor and she was sitting there with him. And he was going through it going, well, I know all this is true, but they won't tell me a thing, not a goddamn thing. Just like that, about all these secret programs. So when she told me that, I said, it sounds like Mr. Clinton. So from '95 until '98, I proceeded then to approach various members of Congress. And we had already started that process thinking, well, okay, if the president won't do an executive action and force his way to control these unacknowledged special access projects, maybe a member of Congress will have the courage to hold a hearing. And since we now have identified, first it was about a dozen, and then it became several dozen top secret guys that could be subpoenaed and swear under oath with penalties of perjury, federal penalties of perjury, if you're testifying before Congress. Go ask some folks who are in prison for lying to Congress about what they knew. And so I started assembling these folks, the first meeting of which was in June of 1995. I'd met with a number of them one-on-one, but there's strength in numbers. So I realized that if we came together as a group and they got to know each other and they felt that it was, they felt safer, they felt protected if they were all doing it together. You see what I mean? Brilliant. Okay, so that was what I did, is pull people together. Because these men and some of the women involved were terrified about speaking about this on their own as lone wolves. But I said, let's get a mass of us together and do it. So that first gathering was very historic because it was sort of presaged what we did in 2001. Now at that point, I decided, look, we are going to have to be very careful with this. So I wanted to be sure that not only did the president have no access, which is in itself proof of the illegality of these unacknowledged special access projects, but that the appropriate oversight committees of the Congress of the United States didn't, as well as key people at the Pentagon. So I proceeded then to do a series of briefings. And in 1997, here in Georgetown at the Westin Hotel, we gathered together, I think about 25 of these top secret guys in a closed meeting, not open to the public, to invite members of Congress, members of the administration, and people from the Pentagon to hear what they knew. And it was a very well organized private event. No media was there and the public didn't know about it. Except in a very limited way. And the idea was that we wanted to get a member of Congress, and like Congressman Dan Burton, who is chairman of the House Government Oversight Committee, Reform and Oversight Committee, that issued 1,000 subpoenas to impeach Clinton about the stain on the blue dress, was there. And he was interested because one of his closest friends, who kept his appointment schedule, had had a UFO come outside her window in Indiana some years ago and told him about it. So he knew the UFOs were real. And he turned to us and he says, I want everything you have, everything you have. And then someone got to him and he didn't hold the hearings. But there were many members of Congress and other people. There were people from the Vice President Al Gore's office there. There were people from the White House. There were people from the Pentagon. The day after that event, I went straight to the Pentagon and did a briefing, what's called a stand-up briefing for J2, the head of intelligence for Joint Chiefs, a different one from the one who forced the meeting at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And this Admiral Tom Wilson hosted us at the Pentagon in the E-ring, where all the admirals and generals are, the outer ring, because they get the views. So the inner ring can't see anything. And I went there with astronaut Edgar Mitchell, myself, a couple of the Disclosure Project witnesses, and my assistant, Sherry Adamak. And what was fascinating is that before I went, I had my military advisor send to the Admiral a document I had received. And it's the first top secret document in the briefing for the President that I did for Obama, which we'll get to in a little bit. And this is dated from the 90s, and it's from Nellis Air Force Base, what people call mistakenly Area 51. It's not the proper name. And this document actually was a security alert because there were some UFO spotters who had penetrated the perimeter of Nellis, and they were going to have to shut down operations with their EMGs, their electromagnetic anti-gravity test flights in that range that they have built. And the list is fascinating for the names of the compartments. And I just want to share a few of them just because, and this is dated 28 July 1991, 0900 hours. And it's from the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, which is the super secret spy satellite operations part of the Air Force originally. So it went to Commander's Net, Royal Ops, Cosmic Ops, that is a clearance. These are all compartmented operations. MAJ, M-A-J, Ops, Magi Ops, COMINT, COMSEC, ELINT, Human Intelligence Ops, AFOSI, Nellis, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and then a whole bunch of different numbered compartments. Red Flag, Dart East, Dart South, Pahut Mesa Military Operating Center, Sally Corridor, key one, Groom Lake, MOC, Dreamland, MOC, Blackjack Team. Blackjack control is at Edwards, by the way. The control is at Edwards, but there was a team at Nellis. Acrotech, Sea Spray, etc. So one of these compartments was known by Admiral Tom Wilson. I don't know which one. But it was being operated through a contractor. All the important stuff is done by corporate, by the way. If it's key, it's corporate. Lockheed Martin, EG&G, E-Systems, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Booz Allen Hamilton, on and on. Edward Snowden, by the way, worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, who contracts for the National Security Agency. So the corporate world is actually where most of the USAPs get centered. And then they interface with these USAPs within military and intelligence, like this. And if you approach it from the government, they say, well, it doesn't exist. And you approach it from a corporate, it's privatized. It's a corporate secret like Microsoft's code. Got it? It's hermetically sealed away from everyone between those two techniques. Very clever. Very illegal, very clever. But the mafia is always very clever. And this is the biggest mafia in the world. So when Admiral Wilson recognized one of these compartments, he contacted them. Now this is prior to me and Edgar Mitchell and other people arriving at the Pentagon in the spring of 1997. And he picked up the phone and he said, this is Admiral Wilson. I'm head of intelligence joint staff, J2. I'd like to be read into, which means briefed. I want to be read into this project, blah. And they say, yes, sir, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know. And he said, God damn it, I'm the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. How can I not have a need to know? And they said, sir, we cannot discuss this with you, and we will not. Click, hung up on him, blocked his line, would not receive any further calls from. This is an admiral in charge of intelligence assessments and putting intelligence together for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon of the United States. Now this I know for a personal fact. So now you have a coup d'etat that extends to even the highest levels of the Pentagon. So by the time I walked through the door to do what was supposed to be a 45-minute stand-up briefing for the admiral and his staff, he was so scared and so mad, he was scared. And the meeting went for 2 hours, and if Edgar Mitchell hadn't had to leave to go to an interview in New York City on some TV show, it would have gone on for 3 or 4 hours. He kept canceling his other appointments. At the end of that briefing, I said, we really need your help. And he said, well, what can I do? They're not going to tell me anything. The best thing I have in my arsenal is the B-2 stealth bomber that I know about. And you're telling me that there are unacknowledged projects that have things that can go trans-dimensional light speed and beyond, that can do circles around my B-2 stealth. He says, it's point, set, and match. I said, well, you still need to help us get control of it. He says, how can I do that without having the Secretary of Defense or the President order me to, without myself doing something rogue? See, here's the good guys are trapped by being good. I said, here's the thing. The only thing bad about nice people is that they're nice. And the people who are rapacious criminals are not nice, and they don't give a damn about the law or people's lives, and they don't mind killing you. So he said, I can't do this. And then he said, well, who else have you met with? I said, well, the CIA director, and I started naming all these people. So he says, well, you know, if those folks are being Schmidt-canned, pushed aside, what am I supposed to do? So he basically threw up his hands. He says, I don't see that I can do anything. There was a man named Gordon Cooper, who most of you may know was someone who gave us testimony about the craft that landed on the dry lake bed in California, Edwards Range, back in 1956, I believe it was, that his crew filmed, and he saw the film footage and sent it back to the Pentagon. Well, Gordon Cooper, very heroic figure, an early Mercury astronaut, and I were speaking to a conservative group called the Federalist Society here in Washington, who were very interested in this, because they were interested in the unconstitutionality, because they're strict constitutional. And I will speak to any group, I don't care, you know, I mean, it's fine, politics, I don't care. So, I mean, I agree with the group's politics all the way through, but they were interested, and they invited me and Gordon Cooper, so we went. So my wife was with me. It was here at the Hyatt, I think, near Capitol Hill. And I was going, so I started talking to Gordon and comparing notes of people we had talked to within the system. And he had been asked by Secretary of Defense Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, who was Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, Secretary of Defense, had asked him directly to give him all the actionable intelligence, all the details needed about that landing event of a craft at the dry lake bed in 1956, because he wanted to see that footage. And he got back to Gordon Cooper and said, I can't find it. It's not accessible. It's in this unacknowledged project, and the Secretary of Defense. So there's another person proven out of the loop. So I started making a list of all the people who had been denied access who by all rights absolutely must know if it's a legal program. Secretary of Defense, President of the United States, CIA director, on and on and on. Then I end up, a couple years after this, getting invited to brief the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes. Now, General Patrick Hughes was a man, you'd often see him with Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton and other people. He was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is like the CIA for the Pentagon. It's almost as large. And it's their in-house intelligence shop, whereas, you know, the CIA is a civilian agency, but this is a military intelligence. But the Defense Intelligence Agency is sort of sits on top of all military intelligence. And he was the director. So, and he's a 3-star general. So I get invited to brief General Patrick Hughes at the Pentagon. So I think, well, let's see what he knows. Of course, he wanted to know what I knew. So again, I sent him a full dossier and briefing prior to arriving so he'd be adequately brought up to speed. We had a meeting scheduled. I go to the Pentagon, full military escorts in, like you always have in these areas. And I go in, and we start talking about this. And he says, well, I find this amazingly interesting. He says, but in all my years in the military, I have never been told anything about it. Nothing. And I said, well, it doesn't surprise me. There are other people in your position. He says, he got up and he went over to a bookshelf. And on it was a little, like you'd get at a toy store, a little E.T. doll, like about this big. And he grabbed it and he says, this is all I've gotten for my inquiries about this issue through channels. In other words, someone gave it to him as a gag gift. Now, there was a full bird colonel sitting at the table during this briefing, and I started explaining the way, you know, these particular, and he knew what an unacknowledged special access project was. This is no, he says, but he didn't know about this one. And he wasn't being, he says, well, I can't imagine that there are operations within the Defense Intelligence Agency that know about this, and they wouldn't tell me when I've asked. I said, well, they do. I mean, they lied to the president, they lied to the CIA director, and they'll lie to you. And the colonel visibly stiffened. Because I said at that moment, there are people on your senior staff who are tasked with this issue, but they don't want you to know for whatever reason. And this colonel stiffened. And my military advisor and I compared notes later. That guy was on the inside lying to the general. The colonel was zooming the general. Illegal? Yes. Treason? Yes. Happens every single day at the Pentagon and CIA. So when you're dealing with an unacknowledged special access project this sensitive. So these are not conspiracy theories. I've been there. I'm the guy who set up these meetings and was there. And I will say that I'm the only civilian you'll ever meet who's had meetings of this nature with people like that all over the world. So I wanted to put this on the record. Now, after this, we had about a 15-minute discussion, and then the general told me something very surprising. He says, you know, my father, this is General Patrick Hughes telling me, my father knew of some kind of illegal conspiracy in the U.S. government back in the 50s and 60s, because he apparently was also a very high official, that was so serious, and we thought the old man was a kook, referring to his father. And he says, I thought this would all be nonsense until I got into this office, until I became the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and contrasted with what I'm being told with what I've seen received from the Disclosure Project, or Project Starlight at that time. And he said that, you know, my father was so upset by this, he eventually ate his gun, committed suicide. And, yeah. You know, and, you know, so the weight of this is huge, huge. So I said, well, you know, you just move on. But he said, I don't know what I can do because they're not going to tell me anything. I said, but I have Disclosure Project witnesses inside the DIA who've seen satellite imagery of ET craft out in space. We have their testimony. He says, well, they won't tell me anything. So, of course, what you realize is that these positions rotate. They're there for a year or 2 or 3 or 4. The president, if he's lucky, 8. But there's this permanent system. So let's call it the permanent secret government versus the one that sort of is this revolving door of folks. Sometimes the people in that system know and sometimes they don't. And since the mid-1950s, the criteria for being on the inside of the secrecy is the following. And this is how I explained it to a 5-star admiral in England, who is also one of our witnesses, Admiral Lord Hill Norton. He was the head of the Ministry of Defense, and he was a Sea Lord, they called them back then. They don't have 5-star admirals anymore. And he was the head of the military committee for NATO. So I went to his cottage in Hampshire some years ago. Emily dropped me off, took the kids to Salisbury Cathedral, I believe, and I continued on, had a meeting with the admiral. And you know, you get a picture of what my life must be like. So nuts, completely nuts. So anyway, so I'm there with this man, and we're sitting in some wingback chairs in his parlor in what he called his cottage in Hampshire, and which is a gorgeous old antiquity house with the thatched roofs and beautiful. And we started talking about this, and he was a very fastidious man. He had a little teeny notepad like this and a pen, and assiduously taking notes, very, very. And we got to this question, and he said, well, you know, the entire time I was the head of the Ministry of Defense, which also means you're head of MI5 and MI6 and the intelligence units in England. It's the same position there. It's separate here. You have CIA Director and Secretary of Defense. There it's one head. And he says, this issue was never briefed to me. I was never told anything. And I said, yeah, that doesn't surprise me now. It would have maybe a number of years ago. And he said, and as the head of the military committee for NATO, I was never told, even though I now have learned NATO was dealing with some of these events, such as the big events that were in Belgium with the massive triangular craft and things like that. Well, I said, he says, and I want to know why they wouldn't tell me. It was like his pride was a sense of propriety. Oh, he was a lord in the House of Lords also. He says, why wouldn't they tell me? And it was a little bit petulant, but also hurt. And I said, well, let me answer your question with a question. And he didn't like that. He thought I was being a cheeky American. And I said, but just bear with me. What would you have done if you found out that there was a cabal that had run amok of the laws of all the democracies, that had this information and had the technologies to completely fix the environment, end global poverty, create a civilization that would be sustainable for thousands of years with these types of free energy technologies, and that they had killed people to keep this secret, assassinated people, and broken the laws of their country and their solemn oaths to uphold their constitutions to do so. He said, I wouldn't have stood for it for a bloody minute. I said, that's why they didn't tell you. I said, the first thing they do when they make a decision that you're in and you're out of the loop of this issue is whether you'll go along with the secret agenda. If you're going to go along with the secret agenda, they'll tell you. And they'll give you a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, and bring you up through the system. If they think that you're the kind of stand-up person who would be appalled when they find out what the criminality of this group is, and how illegal it is, and what damage they're doing to the earth and to the humanity by keeping it secret, and that you might blow the whistle on it, like Jack Kennedy was planning to do in his second term. That's why they took him out. And that's why they took out Marilyn Monroe. I have a document to prove it. And a top secret document from the NSA vault. It's in my first book. Go read it. Nobody reads anymore. But anyway, what was interesting is that he looked at me, he says, that is it then? I said, yes. They do a soul biopsy, like doctors do biopsies. They do a soul biopsy and a psychological analysis to see if you would be willing to go along with that agenda. If you are willing to go along with it, they'll give you little bits until you rise up through the system. If you divert from the system, they take you out. You're going to be dead. So they've learned not to be too reckless with who they tell because they don't want to have to kill too many people and leave bodies scattered that looks conspicuous, like they did in the 50s and 60s with John Foster Dulles and President Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe and other famous people. So I said, that's why it's managed this way. Now, you may have had a predecessor who was MOD head, who came up through that system, who knew all about these projects. So it doesn't have anything to do with your rank. It has to do with your values. It has to do with your willingness to go along with an agenda that is the most criminal, evil, dangerous agenda that any potentates have ever had in the history of the world that we know of. And that's what we're dealing with this super secret Magi group. And they are not going to be reckless in who they read into and pull into those projects. So that is something you have to understand. Now, let's fast forward to the congressional initiatives, which I began in the mid-90s. So I mentioned the chairman of the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee, Dan Burton. There was a man, many of you who were low income, like myself. I was very poor growing up. Probably went to college on something called a Pell Grant. Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island started the Pell Grants, sponsored that bill. And he was at a meeting with the Noetic Sciences Institute, and I did a briefing for him and met with him there. And it was very interesting because he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Very key committee, foreign relations. And he said, you know, I've wondered about this my entire career. We've made inquiries. We've never been given any information through channels. And he said, would you come to Washington and do a briefing for my staff? I said, well, sure, anytime I can come up. I was still living in North Carolina then. And he said, oh, wonderful. And then I looked at him and I said, you know, Senator, the problem with all this is that you're a good man who should be representing humanity to these visitors from interstellar civilizations. And you've been deprived of dealing with the ultimate foreign relations issue, interplanetary relations. And he looked at me through his horn-rimmed glasses and went, you know, Dr. Greer, I'm afraid you may be right. I said, well, I am. Very poignant moment, but that was the way it was. And then I met with Senator Dick Bryan of Nevada, whose home state has, of course, Nellis Air Force Base and the so-called Area 51. He had no knowledge of these projects. So I met with him in a kind of a clandestine little meeting at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. He was flying in, I was flown in, put on one of those little beeping carts, taken to something that looked like a janitor's closet, opened it up, it was a VIP holding area, and I met with the senator. And we were talking about this. He says, I have never been told anything about this when we've gone into the secure, the SCIFs for the intelligence briefings. And so I provide a briefing to him. And it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, the numbers of people I personally briefed, you know, of course, you know, you probably all know about, you know, briefing, I'm blocking on his name, the Kucinich, who ran for president in 2008. And Kucinich was very interested in this, but he wouldn't hold a hearing either, even when he was the chairman of the subcommittee for domestic government reform and oversight. He had had a sighting. Shirley MacLaine outed him during the campaign and embarrassed him. He's very supportive of disclosure. I have his information, I mean, we stay in contact, but he wouldn't hold a hearing. So we went through all these. I mean, it's a whole bunch of people I met with personally. Now, there are people out there who say they're doing stuff with disclosure and lobbying, but they've actually never met with a sitting member of Congress. I'm not going to name names, but that's it. That's what I did for 10 years, from 92 and 3 until 01 and beyond. And also people overseas. The cabinet level member of the Japanese government in charge of science and technology briefed him, very interested. But when I said, will Japan take the lead on disclosure and put this material together? He says, oh no, we can't do it ahead of the United States. He was in terror of the idea of getting ahead of these covert programs. Same thing with meeting with certain members of the royal families in Europe. that I met with. And as you know, I provided a big briefing that was given to Prince Charles by Jamie Cromwell, the actor who played. He said he was kind of playing me in this movie, First Contact, a Star Trek movie. And Jamie Cromwell, they had the opening in London, and Prince Charles came and wanted this briefing we were putting together for the president. And so Jamie Cromwell handed it to him. And I got a lovely note back from Prince Charles about this. But not that Charles could do anything about this issue, but they're interested. There's so much interest. But the people, even if they're in very high positions, they're interested, and now they're known to be briefed. But they have no power over the operations. So as I said over an hour ago, don't conflate knowledge of the issue with access control. Access control is in these unacknowledged special access projects. So that led me to doing something very controversial. And there's my military people said, look, there's a way that we do things in the military, and it's called a UNOD letter, unless otherwise directed. What that means is you write to various people in command and say, unless otherwise directed, here's my assessment and here's what I'm going to do. So they said to legally cover yourself, you need to do a UNOD letter and send it to the head of the Justice Department, the President, the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the whole alphabet soup, the NSA, and send it returned receipt requested so you can prove it was received. And I did that. And that's also in the first book, Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications. And it said, it basically said, and you can read it, it's up on our website, here is our assessment. These projects are being run illegally. They are unacknowledged special access projects that have been unconstitutional since the 50s. The president and other key figures we know have been lied to, as have the oversight committees of the Congress. Similar crisis exists in the United Kingdom and other countries where I have had briefings. Therefore, it is our assessment that the National Security Act and secrecy laws that are attached to oaths of secrecy are null and void, and that any man or woman who has knowledge in any document, material, or evidence attached to the UFO and extraterrestrial issue can be provided and disclosed publicly without penalty of law. This is our assessment, and unless otherwise directed, beginning as soon as we can organize it, we will proceed with disclosing this testimony and these documents. This was what we used to legally cover all 110 top secret military witnesses that came forward. It had to be done. And the reason I couldn't have done that between 93 and 98, I had to go through this torture chamber of finding out that, in fact, and proving not only to myself, for posterity and in my records, that the key people who should know about this do not. And therefore, the programs are illegal. And therefore, if the programs are themselves illegal, they can't cite the law. It's basic constitutional law. If you're a mafia, let's say that a mafia guy's running an illegal project and you enter into a contract with him. That contract is vitiated, nullified, is completely zeroed out because the underlying operation's illegal. So all these men and women who have been at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, who have been with the CIA, the DIA, the Pentagon, who have worked on these projects, we basically exonerated them from any legal penalties for disclosing information about these projects because we were able to prove they were being run unconstitutionally. And therefore, the National Security Act could not be applied. Does everyone understand what I'm just describing? That was the basis for the Disclosure Project of May 2001. And we had to do that because I talked to like Danny Sheehan, who is a constitutional attorney who did the Silkwood case, represented the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers, and he was helping me pro bono on this. I ran this idea by him. So I had my military guys advise me on the UNOD letter, the unless otherwise directed letter, but then I talked to some legal constitutional experts and say, is this a sound legal assessment? Because I'm just a doctor. I know anything about this stuff. And he said, absolutely. If these projects are being run illegally, they cannot then have it both ways. They either have to be under proper oversight and control of the president and the Congress, or they have opted themselves out of the legal system, and therefore they cannot use the legal system to prosecute any of our witnesses or me for having disclosed top secret documents that have not been declassified, which I have done. Now, that's a very big difference from what Snowden did. Snowden disclosed things that were being overseen by the president and were being overseen by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Intelligence Committee. And even though those programs are Big Brother-esque and outrageous, he really should have limited his disclosure, if he's listening, to operations that were unacknowledged and illegal. You see, if he had done that, he would not be in legal trouble. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? He just didn't know. He was young, and he'd had very bad advisors. The journalists and people who were working with him didn't understand the system well. So anyone listening who wants to be a whistleblower, listen to me, contact me before you jump off that plank, because you must only disclose the projects that are USAPs, unacknowledged, and which are unacknowledged to the level that even upon directed inquiry by the key people in the Congress, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the President, they're still lying to them. So those programs then are rogue and illegal. Those you can disclose. And if you can prove that, then you're free sailing. Now, that's what we did. So from 98 until 2000, we gathered together more and more and more of these top secret military people and others. And I went all around the world and interviewed them. There's several dozen of them up on our website at SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS Disclosure.com. Their testimony is a book that we put together called Disclosure. Some of it. I mean, it's so voluminous. To give you an idea, I had 110 hours of testimony that I had to cut down to the 4-hour and 2-hour DVDs that you can get on our website. There's so much material. So it's unbelievable amount of material that that's on digital film. I mean, honestly, I did most of the filming, so it's not professional because I'm a klutz with cameras, but that's all. We didn't have the funding to do this, like a big project. We just did it. It was all, by the way, the Disclosure Project had no paid staff, no office, all volunteers working in our spare time, all of it. So that's how it got done. And it still is how it's happening. So I think that people have to understand that, we did the best we could with what we had. It wasn't like we had a $5 million grant or a $10 million grant to do this. We had a couple $100,000 to travel the world, interview all these people, and launch it at the National Press Club, which became the biggest event in the history of the National Press Club since Ronald Reagan was there. And at the time that we did the May 9th, 2001 event, it was the most watched event in the history of the internet, the entire internet. And the company that hosts the internet broadcasts out of the National Press Club said they had so many people trying to see it, it crashed their system. And that Bill Gates and others were watching this because they had never seen that many people trying to get on to see it. They had to grab every T1 line in Washington at the old system. Now you can handle it, but they couldn't handle it in 2001. And it was all in the media. Eventually, about 800 million people around the world saw it. But then one by one, the media were contacted and told, take this down, take this down, take this down. 4 months later, 9/11 happened. But in the course of all of this, I've learned a lot. But one of the things I've learned is that you cannot expect people in power to bite the hand that feeds them. It's like the old Nine Inch Nails song. Will they bite the hand that feeds them? And the answer is usually not. And the other thing is that the currency that matters is, it's not impressive if you're a billionaire. I know a lot of billionaires. It's not impressive if you have a law degree from Harvard. It's not impressive if daddy left you $10 billion. It's not impressive if you're the president of the United States, if you're not willing to do the right things for the people of the world and of the United States and have the courage to do it. Now, that one word, courage, comes from heart, from the French. Do you have the heart and the courage to do it? That's what's been missing. Because for the most part, our politicians and our attorneys, most politicians are lawyers, they come up in a system where it's self-aggrandizing, naked ambition. And most people in the corporate world and in the political world are not going to do something that could be an enormously dangerous thing for themselves personally and could ruin their careers by being associated with it. And that's why I concluded by 2000 that the people have to do it. We, the people, have to do that. Now, one of the real other issues that came up recently was, have there been people who, over a period of time, been trying to work this within the system? Yes. There's a senior official at the CIA who, for 20 years, has been very, very supportive. He's part of that group, but he's on the side of disclosure. But he can't stick his neck out too far because he saw what happened to former CIA Director Colby. When he stuck his neck out, he was going to give Bill Colby, the CIA Director, I think, for Ford and Nixon, was going to hand off one of these zero-point free energy devices and about $50 million in seed money so we could get it out to the public. And the week he was going to meet with a member of my board, they found him floating down the Potomac River. Almost absolutely was assassinated. We can't prove it, but his best friend, a colonel, met with me and said, yes, that's what happened. And he knew it was a risk. So a lot of people who are friendly to this, who are on the inside, are afraid of being tweaked, terminated with extreme prejudice. And then you have other people who aren't on the inside, who don't have the courage of the ridicule factor, because the New York Times and the Washington Post, the big media outfits that are wholly owned subsidiaries of the intelligence community, frankly, when it comes to this issue, are going to absolutely roast and ridicule any politician that brings up the word UFO. It has to be done like on Kimmel, just sort of ha ha ha, make a joke of it. So in 1953, the CIA decided that the psychological warfare aspects of this would be where the real enforcement could be, by just making it ridiculous. And they actually engaged, I have a document that proves this, Disney Studios, to make cartoons about little green men so that it would become the laughing stock and sort of defang the whole issue into sort of silliness. And so it has remained for 60 years. So it takes a lot of courage, not just in terms of your personal safety, but your reputation, because you're going to be ridiculed and laughed out of meetings, or you're going to be teased. And most people don't want to be ridiculed. I'm just the kind of person, I don't care what someone says about me. I mean, everything terrible you can imagine has been said about me, and so what? I mean, you just expect it. So, but most people in a public eye don't want to do that. And so disclosure is going to have to be with the people. So we initiated that in 2001, and we continue to do that. And I think that the biggest problem we've had, and I wrote a paper about this called When Disclosure Serves Secrecy. Now, this paper, I wish you would read it and memorize it. Everything I predicted in that a long time ago, it's on our website. And if you sign up for our email service, we occasionally send it out. It's a free newsletter. You can just sign up. It's seriousdisclosure.com. It's free. It's completely provided to the public. That paper describes the dangers of doing what we've done. and that is disclosure being hijacked by charlatans who masquerade as disclosure folks, who attach to all the body of evidence I put together the fear factor and the silly season and the evil aliens are coming to eat us for lunch. All right? And that has happened. And the betrayals I will not go into because it will break your heart. So the truth is, the thing that keeps me up most at night is all this information being folded into it, which is all solid information, being folded into disinformation that's tailored to scare the public into what General MacArthur said, and that is World War III will be interplanetary. So now let me talk about the deepest USAP. The deepest unacknowledged special access project is the one that is tasked with doing the psychological propaganda, just like Hitler did with his program, for convincing the people that there's a threat that we should fight. This was launched in the 50s and 60s. First they made the subject ridiculous, and then they made it terrifying, like the movie Independence Day. And this was all part of a plan hatched in the 50s to be sure that we could continue to grow the military-industrial complex, but instead of just one country, sort of a unipolar expenditure out of mainly the United States and at that time Soviet Union, it'd be a global junta military effort because there's a threat from outer space. And they have done about 50 years, 60 years of very, very careful preparation. Now, the UFO subculture is replete with the influence of that. Most people don't understand it. And I wasn't surprised when I got a document in the 1990s from the Strategic Studies Institute describing this project. And this is going to be in our next film, if I can find a director that wants to make this film. And it describes creating a worldwide subculture and cult around alien abductions using stagecraft, I'm quoting, and using advanced aerospace devices, i.e. man-made UFOs, anti-gravities, with creatures that could pass as aliens to engage in events to scare people so that the public could be turned to believe that there's one or more civilizations that we should unite against and fight. And Ronald Reagan at the United Nations literally said, wouldn't our job of creating a unified world be easier if we had a common alien threat? This is, you can Google this clip of Reagan saying this. So that agenda and the Star Wars programs that go with it, and 90+% of all UFO subculture books, movies, conferences are infected with that virus. Now, I'm saying unwittingly in many cases, because how would you know? If you haven't been read into a program that is so sensitive, and I've had physicists who worked at the Dulce complex and at the Pine Gap complex in Australia, that where they manufacture these what are called programmed life forms, these things that look like aliens that are 100% man-made, have integrated circuits in their neural complex, but they're biologicals, and they're on board these. But the people running the craft are military or corporate guys. And they'll sick these things on people, and they'll abduct them and put an implant in them. And the implants are made by EG&G. They're on the edge of the Nellis Range. You want to hear more? This is the stuff people really hate me for. Because I was told that if I expose this, this is where I'd be most at risk. Okay, because now I'm stepping on the toes of the eschatological fantasies of the people who want endless war. Eschatology is the study of how the world's going to end. And at the core of this secret group are folks who want to precipitate an Armageddon-type conflagration that's War of the Worlds. Because they love and they do it because they want people to be united around another common enemy, not just one country or subculture or religion, but the whole planet. Go look at the movie Independence Day. It's a script right out of the CIA. And so the whole point of that is that you have got to prepare people to hate. So, you know, it's not politically correct to hate someone who's African American if you're white, or if a gay person if you're straight, or hate women if you're a male, or a Jewish person. But it's completely okay to hate an entire planetary group of people, whether they're called grays or greens or purples or whatever, because they know that humans have within them this flaw. And it's in the primate monkey mind that is the root of tribalism. And I want to deconstruct this for a moment. We are 98.5% identical to chimpanzees and gorillas. And chimpanzees and gorillas do organize into troops and into warring sects that kill each other. And it is usually based on slight differences of whether territory or appearance. And this can be exploited by demagogues, whether it's religious demagoguery, racial demagoguery, sexism, homophobia. Just pick it. Well, the big one is interspecies. So the next one is, let's get everyone prepared, and we can use these images, just like Hitler used the image of, you know, the blood libels of Germany, you know, portraying Jewish people as grinding up children for matzah meal and this outrageous stuff that was propaganda. No, this is all true. Go look it up. Unfortunately, most people don't know any history, but you know, if you go look up the history of World War II, there was a foundation built for years for the Third Reich. That's what the Fourth Reich is doing, this secret government. And they've done it very well, extremely well. Now, I met with a man who would not come forward, who was on one of these early abduction squads. Now, don't get me wrong, not everyone who's had contact has had a false abduction happen, but the whole thing's been commingled. I've had contact, but it wasn't an abduction. So what I tell people is that if you mix this together and people don't know that there are two distinct things going on, you think they're all the same phenomenon, when they are not. And this man said in the early days, before they had these programmable things that look like life forms, that look alien, they would use little guys that were short and do a Hollywood mask and suit on one of these anti-grav devices. This is back in the 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s, and abduct people. And so they started this program a long time ago. And it's very easy to do. Very easy if you understand the technology. Now, this is the other problem. Most people don't understand the extraterrestrial technology, and if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand what the reverse engineering spinoffs have been, one of which is what I'm describing. So when they realized that they could stagecraft this, and this is described in the Strategic Studies Institute document. I don't know, the director of the film Sirius didn't want to put that in there. He thought it was too controversial. The next film will have it in there. I'm going to override whoever the director is. This has got to be in there. But that way you prepare the population for a new enemy to fight. How else can you grow the military-industrial complex from $1 trillion a year enterprise to a $3 trillion or $4 trillion or $6 trillion? You have to have an enemy. As Leon Panetta said, we're spending $110 billion a year to chase 70 Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. He said that. So how do you keep that juggernaut going? You've got to have another and a bigger enemy. So in the meanwhile, they'll concoct and create and keep the fire burning, manipulate the world to keep the fire burning deliberately. And that's what we've seen over the last decade. We go in and break Iraq, and then it creates, it just keeps this fire burning. However, the big surprise that's coming, 1,000 times worse than 9/11, is this false flag operation to stage a threat from outer space. There was a man who came to the congressional briefings in 1997, and he was prepared to open this entire box, Pandora's box of issues, to the members of Congress there. and I will not share his name. I keep a confidence he was going to do it. The night before the congressman came, some intel people came to his room who he had worked with in those projects and begged him not to disclose it. And so he left. He was actually taken that night to a secure facility out in Virginia, and we never saw him again. He left a note under Sherry Adamak's door explaining what happened. But he had told me privately, would not go on camera, that he in 1974 had been on an interagency intelligence committee that had all this already planned out, and they could hit a button and they could release events that would look like ET craft that are man-made anti-gravities, do things that would look like an alien assault on Earth that would stampede the entire world like 9/11 did into fear, where they would then be able to say, our next big challenge is to stave off the alien invasion. And I said, how ready was he? He says, we could have hit a button and the whole thing would have run, and that was in '74. Now, that's only because he was on that committee in 1974. I'm sure he told me, but he said it was fully operational well before then. So we're getting into some really deep and dark stuff here. Some people are very disturbed when I share this. I don't think we have to, it's childhood's end today. You have to go into this with eyes wide open. And so one of my real concerns in putting together all the evidence and information I have on this is that then there are other people who are within the UFO subculture who will take the disclosure moniker and fold it into mutilations and abductions and evil aliens and this and that and the other thing. And I warned about this 10 or 15 years ago. And so it has come to pass. And I am very disturbed by it. It's the one thing that makes me want to shut down all my efforts. Because I don't want to hurt human consciousness more than it's already been injured. You know, my whole purpose is to help us get to a point where we become a peaceful planet that becomes interplanetary and interstellar. Not World War III that's interplanetary. But people who are not very nuanced in their thinking, or as Dr. Richard Haynes at NASA used to say, unselective filters, non-selective filters. They just let anything through and are not discerning, will take information and documents and witnesses and people I have and then fold it in to this other disinformation, and they do not have the discernment because they have not been at meetings with people from Pine Gap and Lockheed and the Cube. The Cube is the big underground facility that Lockheed Martin Skunk Works runs up in the high desert near Edwards Air Force Base. It's the state of the art where all these things are done. And at Dulce, which does exist. There's a man on my team who worked at Los Alamos National Labs as an engineer, senior guy, who knew a man who got on an underground connector going from Los Alamos to Dulce to work on these projects. Now, if you go to Dulce, there's nothing there because it's accessible only underground. It's accessible from Los Alamos, it's accessible from Nellis, and it's accessible from Edwards, all the way from Edwards, Air Force Base in the high desert of California. But these underground connectors, this is no myth. They do exist, and they're maglev, anti-grav, sort of, but they're underground. And you go in one place, and boom, surface in another. Now, this brings up the question is, it's like the old song from the 70s, Don't Be Fooled Again, or The Who, we won't be fooled again. Will we? And I think that's the problem. Knowledge is the greatest purifier, it says in the Vedic and tradition in the Bhagavad Gita. So knowledge is key. We have to share this information, but we have to do it in a way that presents the full story. And that's what I wanted to do today, is to provide the background of disclosure, but also how fraught it is for being hijacked by people who lack the wisdom, frankly, and the insight to know that they're being played by the intelligence community like a fiddle, and putting out information that can only pollute human consciousness to convince people, yes, the UFOs are real and the ETs are out there, but some of them we need to be afraid of and fight in the next big world war. one person asked me once, how can you prove that all of them aren't hostile? I said, well, I can't. You can't prove a negative. It's axiomatic. But I was asked this at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Let me tell you a little story that very instructive. So we're there, and there's a colonel there who was in charge of this operation at Wright-Patterson, and Bruce Ashcroft, who was an intelligence officer, although he was posing as a public information officer. He's really Air Force Intel, a suit. And so my military advisor and I, and another man who'd worked for the State Department and who was also a naval intel guy was with me. And so I went from the Rockefeller Ranch to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to this place where all this stuff from Roswell was originally sent. And we had this meeting because it was forced on them by the head of J2, the previous one I briefed, my people briefed, Tom Wilson, Admiral Wilson. And when we got in there, we basically said, we're not here to get information from you because we know what you have here. We've already penetrated what's here. We're here to provide information to you so that you do not interfere with what we're doing with the CE5 contact initiative. So civilians are not caught in the crossfire between you guys and what you're doing with ETs. That was the purpose of the meeting, remember. It's very high stakes. The one thing I don't want to do is have a group of people caught in the crossfire. So not that the ETs would hit them, but our folks might accidentally, and we almost were hit at Mount Shasta a few years ago. Yeah, I'll tell you this story if you want to hear about it during the question and answer. But during this meeting, the colonel finally, at one point said, well, how do you know that these intelligences from elsewhere aren't a threat to us? I said, well, sir, given the galactically stupid things we have been doing, chasing them, firing at them, developing laser, particle beam, and other weapon systems, and knocking enough of them down that you've been able to reverse engineer them. If they were hostile, and they have interstellar transportation technologies, it would have been point, set, match, over in 1945, about the time we developed the atomic weapon. The fact that you and I are having this conversation and breathing the free air of Earth is abundant testimony to the fact that they are non-hostile, even if they may not be pleased with our stupidity. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these civilizations are altogether in thrall with what's going on this planet. Who would be? Take a look around. But if they were overtly hostile, it could be over in a nanosecond. Because let me explain to you what the technologies are. Okay, all of you have looked at video games and Star Wars movies and Star Trek and other rubbish. So, okay, wipe your mind clean of all the rubbish that Hollywood puts out. Now let's get into some real science for just a minute. If you're going from one star system to another, I mentioned this earlier, you have the ability to create an electromagnetic field and go post-quantum, what Einstein called the spooky effect, where it's the same particle appears in two places at once, like that. And it has to do with non-locality in physics, the non-local cosmos, and other dimensions. But the power associated with that under a controlled circumstance is almost infinite. And if you were to take that knowledge and weaponize it, you could take a planet, target it, turn it into a pink mist floating through space instantly. It would not be a bunch of little laser guns going like this, like you're playing, So if these civilizations have gotten here, by definition, they're interstellar. And if they're interstellar, they're transdimensional. And if they're transdimensional, they have technologies that would make our hydrogen bombs look like a Tinker toy. All right? And yet here we sit, notwithstanding the fact that we have been using electromagnetic weapon systems to target them and knock them down since 1947. The Roswell crash was a targeted electromagnetic switch that knocked two craft down. They actually collided with each other. One went down near Roswell, one continued and impacted near Socorro. This is in an FBI document where it talks about a new radar system, that's a euphemism, that was turned on, and these two ET craft hit each other, went down. I know men who have operated the state-of-the-art ones that began to be developed in the 50s and 60s. And now we're 60, 70 years into what are called scalar or longitudinal electromagnetic systems, which are sort of electromagnetic pulses that instead of having a wave like this, are point radiation. So they're multiples of the speed of light. And this scalar technology has been worked on for the better part of 100 years in some circles, but certainly intensely for 70. So we have used those systems to track and target ET craft since the 40s. So if they were in fact so hostile, we would have known about it massively. Now, it isn't to say that they may have interests that run counter to the dominant paradigm on Earth. But what's the dominant paradigm on Earth? War. The dominant industry of the world, the number one largest, is war making. And still is in 2015, when we should have had world peace 100 years ago with the League of Nations. So this is a big question. And so they may be viewing us a bit jaundicely and cautiously. And as one British intelligence officer told me, when we detonated the first atomic bomb, a big red flag went over this planet, and it was like kicking a hornet's nest. They became very concerned that we were reaching very advanced technologies and science that was instantly being weaponized and being used against one another. And that meant that we became an existential threat to ourselves, and in time, we, humans, could be an existential threat to other worlds. So that's part of the concern, and it's justified concern, because humans don't have a great track record. Now, this is only because the good people of the world, I mean, most people on the planet are not wanting to blow the planet up. I lived in the Middle East for 3 years. Most people, Arab, Israeli, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, they just wanted to educate their kids. And I mean, if you get 10% of sociopaths who want to create trouble, your society's a wreck. And that's what we're dealing with. The good people have allowed the 10% or 5% of sociopaths and psychopaths to run amok, which is what happened with Hitler in Germany. So the good people have to find their courage. And that's our job, your job, my job. So I view this as something all of us have to do. It isn't, don't look to the President of the United States, as John Podesta said. And by the way, a little footnote on that, people think his interest in this was recent. It wasn't. After we did the National Press Club event in 2001, he publicly came out in favor of disclosure. This is the senior advisor to the President, Obama. And also, he was chief of staff for a number of years, 4 or 5 years, for Bill Clinton, during which time we were doing all this with this Project Starlight, which has been misnamed the Rockefeller Initiative. It wasn't Rockefeller's initiative, it was Project Starlight's initiative, frankly. So, but Podesta was always aware that, in a sense, what Truman and then Clinton said about the White House is that it's the crown jewel in the federal penitentiary system. That once someone is in that system, they're so in a box. And when he left the Obama administration recently, he tweeted out, which became this big uproar, about how one of his regrets was not being able to effect UFO disclosure. Now, some people thought it was a bit of a joke, but it wasn't, because there's a press conference in 2002, after we did our 2001 National Press Club event, where he talks about disclosure and needing to end secrecy and release the UFO files and information. But his interest goes back to the Clinton era, before, because he was chief of staff for Clinton when we were doing all this work, prior to what the public knows as the Disclosure Project. Does that make sense? So he was also the POC, the point of contact, for Obama and for the briefing that's here that I provided after Obama was elected. And he assembled the Obama cabinet, did not immediately take a role in the Obama White House, but he put the cabinet together. He was the head of the transition committee between the election and January 20th, when Obama was inaugurated in January 20th of 2009. And there was a man who was doing a course with him at Georgetown Law School, who's an attorney here in town who wants to be anonymous, who said, look, you know, he's very interested in this, and, you know, the president, of course, is going to be in the same situation they all are. And so I was asked to put together a briefing, and it went to this man for Podesta and Obama. Because Obama was, you know, looking to John Podesta as sort of his secrecy guru, because he had been a senator from Illinois or someplace for a couple years. He didn't know anything about all this. And he wasn't going to be told by his CIA director, Leon Panetta, because I sent this same thing to Leon Panetta, because he didn't know anything, being CIA director. So that's kind of my role, is to be the bridge between this unacknowledged world and that world when I'm asked to do it. And it continues. So last year, I was, about a year and a half ago, I was in Australia on an island with 120 world leaders. I was asked, the year before that, it was the Director of National Intelligence, who had just retired, who briefed them. And 2 years before, it was Bill and Hillary Clinton. That year, it was my turn in 2013, and I presented all this material to all these people in the world. So I continue to do this, and then my wife and I will send out packages of disclosure stuff to colonels and people in Switzerland and people at Davos, and, you know, it's this whole networking thing. By the way, that's where your tuition is going, because these things are very expensive to do, and we have no funding and no staff. Emily and I, just with some volunteers, do all this. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about these leaders in the world is that most of them are just agog when they hear about it. They go, oh, well, I'm Minister of Defense of Australia or whatever, and I've never heard of any of this going on at Pine Gap. And they're not lying. I said, well, no, you wouldn't. So it's sort of an unenviable thing to have to do, because I'm really the deliverer of very bad news. To have to show it to someone that powerful and say, by the way, here's what you don't know that you're being lied to about. But so we continue to do that. But the big action, and that's sort of a service to people in government, because I view the good people, and there are good people in government, as victims of this secrecy, just like we are. Where they failed is in their constitutional duty to take on that machine. And that's where the courage comes in. And I think that's why we're going to have to view ourselves as the leadership, all of us in this room and the people out in the public who support disclosure. And the next wave of disclosure are going to be two things we're going to talk about after our break in a moment. One is a mass defection program. What am I talking about? We've got to network, tell everyone we know, and find another wave of people who are currently deeply involved in these covert programs, who will approach me, and we will massively defect at once. Because even what I'm sitting on, there's probably 10 or 15% that's out in the public domain. Some people I've interviewed have asked me not to release it till they're dead. Fantastic. Okay, so that's the next phase. The other is mass contact. We have got to create teams all over the world that are skilled in the art of the CE5, Close Encounters of Fifth Kind protocols, who go out on a regular basis and create in consciousness, but also in action, the ability for mass contact to happen that's peaceful before this false flag creates the overlay. So it's a race. We're a race against the clock. And so that's how it has to happen. And that's something that you don't have to sit on your hands waiting for the president to do, or for that matter, me to do. That's something all of us can do. Yeah, and people who've done the CE5 initiative, even using the app, we get reports every day on our website of amazing contact and things that they've had. So if more and more people start doing that, the ETs are going to get the message that not everyone on planet Earth is sleepwalking. See, they need to see that. Now, people have asked me, Larry King asked me, why don't they just land on the White House lawn or their Super Bowl game? I said, yeah, they could do that. But all that would do would trigger mass panic, because these folks in the intelligence community would say, we're being invaded. We need to fight them. They know not to hit that tripwire. They want us to invite them and create the correct atmosphere of universal peace in consciousness and action to make contact. Then they'll come. We build it, they'll come. They're here anyway, even when they're invisible, because most of the time they're shifted beyond the speed of light and you can't see them anyway. This is what I'm going to talk about in LA at this workshop I'm doing in Glendale. But I think that's why, if we understand how powerful we each are, not only to find more and more mass defecting witnesses inside Booz Allen Hamilton and inside the CIA and Lockheed Martin and Skunk Works and Dugway Proving Grounds and Nellis Air Force Base and Pine Gap. And I have a whole list of corporations and facilities that I've updated of where these operations are currently going on. And we need to have people in those systems come out. Not trickle out one at a time with no credibility, but en masse, just like the 01 event, but on a larger and deeper level. So that's what I'm calling for now. And then the other is all of us becoming ambassadors to the universe as citizen ambassadors, peaceful contact. And that's something every single person can do in their own community. And if you do it and you practice it and learn what the protocols are, you'll be quite stunned at what will happen. It's beautiful.
How do these groups manage to get money from the, because they get government money, how do they do that since they're working outside the realm of typical government agencies?
He asks, how do they get the money from public coffers to run these sort of projects? It's actually a very good example of it is one of our witnesses who worked for SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, in La Jolla, California, is the headquarters. And this is one of the crown jewels of the contracting entities that deal with this issue. And SAIC deals with many issues, but they sort of have companies within companies within companies. That's the way it's structured. And this particular witness, who's one of the Disclosure Project witnesses, was a woman who had been recruited to work for the company. And she was in a program that basically was a room and a bunch of file cabinets. And what she did, they took in millions of dollars based on a grant and or a proposal for funding research. It went into their office, went out the back door of the funds to a black project. And what she and the other people in the office did was gin up reports that would go back to the government and to the auditors that were completely bogus. And when she asked, where is this, what's the real research going on with this money, she was shown a file just full of these empty reports. So obviously that's fraud, but that is how they work. So for example, the B-2 stealth bomber might cost a few $100 million actually to build. They tell the Congress they cost $2 billion a piece. Well, the other missing 1.3 billion goes into the EMGs, the electromagnetogravitics or other unacknowledged special access projects. So this is sort of just the way it is done. And because of the nature of top secret compartmented, top secret TSSCI, top secret special compartmented intelligence, when you get to the unacknowledged level, nobody unless you're in that compartment, you're not going to report anything out to any external person. I don't care who it is. Certainly not the Congressional Budget Office or the auditors at KPMG or whoever it is. They just don't report it out. It'll be reported out on these phony things. And this is why when Rumsfeld said there's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for. I mean, again, this was not a flaming liberal. It's not Abby Hoffman saying this. This was the Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney saying this. So if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe him, and that it's just unaccounted for. But that's how it's done. This one little example, so a lot of it is kind of overbilling and overcharging. You hear about these massive costs, 500% cost overruns, 1,000%. Well, it's not cost overruns per se. part of it is that it's just going into a black project and being diverted, but not just Department of Defense and CIA. I have people who worked with the first Bush presidency, Bush Sr., who said that they were pulling money out of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and other agencies that would be things that were inflated prices that would then be siphoned off into black projects. And that is done routinely. And so, now, there's another way of doing it. I don't know if I should go into this or not. This is this is the dark end of it. Okay, so there, you know, one of the meetings I had was right after we did the meetings in 1997 for members of Congress and for Admiral Wilson at the Pentagon, the J2, head of intelligence joint staff. I had a meeting with a former member of Congress and a senior executive with SAIC at Crystal City here near National Airport at this former congressman's condo. And this congressman had been for many years sort of a consigliere to George Bush Sr. And he said, "Do you understand how dangerous this group is?" I said, "Yes." He says, "But do you understand where a lot of their funding comes from?" I said, "I have a very good idea. Where are you going with this?" And the SAIC executive had recently retired and moved out of the country to France. And both these people asked me not to disclose their names, but this has put me under sodium pentothal. I'm telling you the truth here. They said, "Well, we use these anti-grav devices, and they launch wee hours of the night from various places, and they move billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of clandestine drugs and armaments around the world." And he said there is one group that is involved, it's like a small army, he said, of people of 8,000 men that have been involved in just moving contraband around the world because it's all cash and it's untraceable. And we have killed 2,000 of these men for minor infractions of security. Okay, this is not a conspiracy theory. These were two principals with firsthand knowledge of it, warning me of what this group is really into. So one of the reasons, therefore, fast forward to another problem. If the drug war has been created so that by making it illegal, it not only keeps it criminalized, but it creates a domain where so these super black illegal operations can kind of pluck the low-hanging fruit and have a very large, I'm talking hundreds of billions of dollars of funding by being kind of integrated with these criminal enterprises. You know, now I'm not in favor of drug use, but I think it should be completely legalized for that reason. And that would just suck all, it won't be. Now, they'll wrap themselves in morality and public health and all this other stuff. They could care less. I mean, you know, any kid, any middle school kid can go to anywhere and get any drug they want in the DC area or even out in Virginia in the rural area I live in. It's so that it creates their own little monopoly, and it does. And this is not a conspiracy theory, because I have met with the principals who were involved in those operations. So that's another source of funding. Now, there's another source of funding. So we have the black budget of the United States government, 100, 200 billion a year. You have this clandestine and very dark criminal enterprise running drugs and armaments. And then you have another source, and that is, I call them the corporate spin-offs. Pieces of junk like this. The technologies at Murray Hill facility, AT&T in the early days, Bell Labs, Lockheed, there's a lot of technologies that have been spun out of, as Colonel Corso said in The Day After Roswell, that were studied that have made their way into the public by studying extraterrestrial materiel that have come from our downing of these aircraft, spacecraft. Those end up going first into these unacknowledged projects, but then they get moved into their corporate partners and then get monetized as a product. Fiber optic, integrated circuits, computerization, miniaturization, special material sciences, a lot, night vision technology. A lot of these things came out of those classified projects that were studying ET technologies. Now, what they've held back are the energy generation and propulsion systems, but they have monetized and become enormously wealthy through these others that have been monetized. Now, we, the taxpayers, have paid for that research, but it ends up getting a patent and gets spun out as, look what we invented. Now, most people, and it's interesting that this guy named Thiel, who was one of the co-founders of PayPal, I believe, recently said in an interview with Fareed Zakaria on CNN that there has been no real discoveries and progress technologically in 50 or 60 years. And this was on CNN. It still takes you the same amount of time to go from JFK to Paris now as it did in 1964, 50 years ago. And that basically what we've done is sort of tinker around the edges. Now, I know people, when they hear me say this, the people in Silicon Valley and who think they're high tech with this, I mean, we had telephones 100 and some years ago, so are just like appalled. I said, yeah, but the internet was developed by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. The technologies that are in here were spun out of these covert programs, and then people innovated them. They did innovation and applications, not discovery. So, and if you come up with a fundamental new discovery in science and technology that is really disruptive, i.e. free energy or something like that, it will be confiscated, either under a national security order or if it goes through the patent process through the patent law provisions for seizure. And if not that, they'll just flat out take it and tell you to be quiet or else. And that's true of people at universities, industry, private inventors, et cetera. I know many people who've had that happen. Here in Washington, the Federation of American Sciences said, well, look, there have been 5,135 patents that have been seized. Well, the reason for that is that the things they don't want out are things that are true breakthroughs. So if you look at our society, yes, we have an internet and you have an app so you can go find your restaurant you want to find instead of looking through the yellow pages. But it's just the yellow pages is digitized. It's no big deal. We're still running this thing and all the lights in this building off a coal-fired power plant from the 1800s. Your car is the same engine Mercedes had in the 1800s, internal combustion. The jet engines were developed in the 30s, invented. Rockets, 40s. Atomic power, 1945. No real fundamental breakthroughs in science and technology since then. And that's what Thiel was saying. Thiel, the multi-billionaire. And I think it was sort of an astonishing statement for a lot of people, but he was being honest about it. So, but there has been monetization that way, which has created enormous revenue for a lot of these corporations.
What do we have in any of our encounters with medical technology that's been sequestered?
You asked the question, what do we have that has come about through some of these research projects and encounters that are medically related? A lot. My understanding is that if the technologies that deal with regenerative capabilities exist, transdimensional, that are sequestered, where you could actually regenerate spinal column or a severed limb and nerves, things of this sort, cancer, other diseases. But the problem is those use technologies that are transdimensional. What do I mean by that? They use subtle energy technologies that aren't just kind of like acupuncture, but I mean that are, you know, electromagnetic systems that are very, very high tech. Almost like in Star Trek where they wave a thing, you know, but that would actually work reliably. But there too, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in pharmaceutical and conventional medical. There's agribusiness, medi-business, military-industrial complex. A lot of toes would be stepped on. But also, more importantly than that, is that if you open a window into an application that's medical related to these technologies, people are going to see the energy implications of it. And with that, it's goodbye oil. It's goodbye coal. So they've been sequestered for the same reason the energy and propulsion technology. Yes, I understand from men and women I've worked with that there are amazing technologies that relate to medical systems and curative and reparative, regenerative technologies that are trans-dimensional electronic systems that would just blow your mind. Yeah, and so unfortunately, you know, in a sense, our medical system is sort of Stone Age from that point of view.
But there is medical information that can help.
Yes, there's medical information that can help. And one of the things I've said, there are multiple, look at this whole issue of disclosure. First, there's the basic information, we're not alone in the universe. Then there's the fundamental technology, energy, propulsion. And then there are all the ancillary or associated technologies, you know, medical, environmental abatement. Ken Shoulders, who was a scientist, discovered charged clusters that would, under right conditions, neutralize radioactive material. So you could take all the radioactive waste in the world and neutralize it. This was proven. And the Department of Energy was going to fund the next level of it, and the people in this cabal circled their limousines and said, no, you will not. Because it was pulling energy from this quantum vacuum 0 point to do it. I know the people who are part of that initiative, all of them. So there are so many spin-offs and benefits of disclosure of this central issue, but that's the reason it's secret, is that the implications are so huge. It's not just the energy sector or the transportation sector. It's the medical, it's the pharmaceutical, it's all of it. But, you know, would 99.999% of humanity benefit if it was used peacefully? Now, there's a big caveat. If it was used peacefully, yes. The bigger question becomes, as a colonel who was in charge of future technologies for the Air Force, and I discussed here in DC not long ago, what if they're weaponized? I said, well, they already have been, haven't they? But they're covertly weaponized. But what if they proliferate and are weaponized? So this gets into sort of the larger question, evolutionary question of, are we willing to go forward as a peaceful civilization or not? Because we are at a crossroads where if we don't go forward peacefully, we won't go forward at all. And it's not world peace, it's universal peace. It's interplanetary. So one path leads to, it's like the Hopi line or the Hopi prophecy rock. One line leads to termination and the other one leads forever out into the future, into the stars. We are the last generation to make that decision. We don't have another 100 years. So that's why this is so critical. It's why I left my medical career to work on this, because I came to realize, once I realized what was behind the secrecy, why it's so secret, that it really doesn't matter. I mean, yes, I can save one life at a time in the ER, or maybe 3 or 4 when I'm really busy, but I used to have to run multiple code blues. Code blues when your heart stops. But now we have the responsibility of the earth and all of her children for the next thousands of years in the balance, hanging in the balance. So humans have been trying to make this transition for a very, very long time, and it keeps getting thwarted by, let's say, call it special interests, people who are hell-bent on maintaining the status quo of the financial system, the political system, whatever it is. But there has to be let's say, a nonviolent revolution that has to take place. I'm not a violent person, but I don't think you let these the sociopaths who have another agenda to continue to call the shots as they have for the last 100 years. We have to have the good people step forward. Most people, though, who are nice are too nice. And one thing that I found very early on in 1992, when the head of Army intelligence threatened me, I said, basically, screw you and the horse you rode in on. You get in my way, you'll be in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for the rest of your life, because I've got witnesses and documents that involve you in covert illegal projects back when you were a young officer. And he went, oh. I said, you want to get on the dance floor? Come on. Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff that, but that's, so that's ugly, perhaps, but, you're not going to threaten me and get away with it. But I think that most people, here's one of the problems, is that people are either too nice or they don't have the courage. Like so many of the technologies that I know are held by people who are out there that we've met with, who could bring out these technologies, the first time someone comes up to them and goes, boo, they put their tail between their legs and they run. They're not willing to take the risk. Now, you have to be willing to take the risk, including losing your life, or you can't go anywhere with something like this. Or if they know they can put you on the run with the least little threat of defaming you or threatening you or what have you, they know they've got you, because that's what's going to happen. So the currency the only currency that matters, you have to know about this, you have to have the vision of what to do, there has to be a certain fund of knowledge and intellect, is why I'm sharing. But when push comes to shove, how much heart, courage do you have? And that's true of these medical technologies, it's true of the basic energy technologies, and it's true of the state of the world. So we have to find our hearts, we have to find our ability to come together so that the good people of the earth prevail over these sociopathic folks who have a eschatological agenda, who love, sort of endless war and have the sort of the crescendo happen with some sort of bizarre, Armageddon type thing. Now, of course, if they keep fooling around, they may get their wishes, because the earth isn't going to be able to endure 7 billion people living like we do indefinitely. I mean, we have both polar ice caps melting, and the equilibrium of the earth is becoming, including the magnetic field, increasingly unstable. So this instability is going to increase and not decrease if we stay on the path we're on. It's like the old saying, unless we change directions, we're likely to end up where we're going.
Yeah, regarding disclosure, the issues of free energy technology and such, is this a proper picture? It seems that the direction of disclosure, looking down the road, is one of greater consciousness. Is that true?
Right. Right.
That's what you're really looking for.
Well, yeah, he's asking, is the big picture about disclosure is greater consciousness. It's not just greater, it's the correct consciousness that can support a peaceful application of this. And also a new way of, as Einstein said, no problem was ever solved by the consciousness that created it. And the problem of endless war and the problem of taking every advance of technology and turn it into a new type of club to hit someone in the head with, this is a big problem. And as this colonel in the Air Force pointed out, these technologies would enable someone in another country to deliver a payload in less than a second from the Middle East to Washington. Think about it. Okay, so all technologies can be weaponized. Now, in covert programs, they already have been. But so on the one hand, we have to acknowledge that there's this secrecy. It needs to be overseen properly. But the disclosure is when the work begins. When this information is fully out there, including the technologies beginning to come out, we're going to have to completely change the way the world thinks and works. Now, it's going to have to be a world of collective security, where if there's anyone, anywhere on the face of the earth, that weaponizes and tries to use these technologies for harm, they are stopped by all means necessary, and I mean all means necessary. Could we do it? Yes. Now, do we already have the means to monitor and enforce that? Yes. Why haven't we? Because they want to subvert world peace by keeping endless war going. Because war, for the recorded history of the human race, has been the central organizing principle of every city, state, and nation. And they don't know what to do. How do you organize people if all of a sudden there's world peace? So, an interplanetary peace. So, I always point out, we don't want to have a unified, peaceful world in order to have interplanetary war. Now, this is the going backwards a big step, not forward. So, but that is the biggest jump in human consciousness we've ever seen. And it is a spiritual and social, psychological issue more deeply than it is a technological or information one. Absolutely, 100%. Yes, sir.
There's so many people now worldwide working on zero-point energy. It almost feels like the genie's out of the bottle, and the forces of be cannot possibly contain all of them. What is your view? Are any of them close?
Yes, so there's so many people working on zero-point and similar approaches, and the genie's getting out of the bottle. Can they contain all of them, and is anyone close? Yes, they can contain them, and yes, there are people close. In fact, there are people who have them. Let me give you one example. We believe there's a fellow named Rossi in Italy who has a device that generates apparently over unity excess energy and heat. Although no one knows the mechanism of action, he's keeping it a trade secret. Very big and probably fatal error. The people I've met with who have developed these systems have all either taken it to their graves or had them confiscated before they can get out to the public significantly because of some central strategic errors that have to do with the idea that they're going to be able to handle that technology like you would a new app or a new Silicon Valley computer system. When you're dealing with something like this, it has to be done completely openly, open source, and you have to have millions of people know what's happening in real time. Stan Meyer took his knowledge to the grave. You know, if you look at the workshop I did about a year ago here, is that there have been literally hundreds or maybe thousands of people who have discovered this same effect. And they've all made the same set of predictable errors based on their handling the technology as if it were conventional technology when it is not. And so I would say, yes, there are people out there who are working on it. Some, I believe, have. I have a friend at Stanford University who knows a man at the National Security Agency who confided that they're tracking what Rossi is doing very carefully, which indicates to me where there's smoke, there's fire. If Rossi's listen, heads up. So, but strategically, tactically, and strategically, he's handling it in a way that guarantees failure. Because by keeping it tightly held, coveting, trying to keep it secret, overly concerned with monetizing the technology instead of getting it out, he is going to step into every booby trap that's been set out there. And the chances that it will make its way out to the public is infinitesimally small. And that's not just true of Rossi's technology, but of every other person who has that same idea. Again, it's because the system exists to hoover up, suck up all those technology and sequester them. Now, I just recently learned in the last couple months of a man who was working with a group of investors who was funding a man up in New York at a university, a professor, a physicist, who had discovered how to take just natural gas and burn it so there was zero carbon and 100% utilization. That technology was going through the second round of funding and was bought out by a division of the Army and black shelved. This is fairly recent. There was another technology he was working on dealing with batteries. And as you know, like Tesla Motors has like 900 pounds of lithium batteries in that car. It's a very inefficient system. We have a Chevy Volt. that it runs on our solar farm out in the country. But it's incredibly backward technology. And a group had developed a battery that was, instead of 900 pounds, 100 pounds, that would charge in 15 minutes. That would take okay. But it was so radical that Tesla and some of the other groups had put together, I think it was about $1 billion between two different groups to acquire it, and British Petroleum came in, bought it for God knows how much, and black shelved it. This is fairly recent. So these are not conspiracy theories. This happens every day. So if you have a technology and you go the conventional investor route, funding route, patent route, intellectual property route, it's DOA, dead on arrival. Now, we've seen this over and over again, going all the way back 100 years. So, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. All right? So what I want to say to these technologists and inventors is that don't keep making the same mistake. But ultimately, the money factor and the greed factor and the power factor, people wanting power and money and da-da-da, they really think they can just be like the next Facebook guy or the next, you know, Standard Oil, Rockefeller family. That thinking is what ends up being their Achilles heel, because ultimately it ain't going to work that way, and someone's going to have more money and power than the next person has, and they're going to buy it out, or it's going to get sequestered through a national security order. So the only way to do it that I can see is to do it openly, transparently, in real time. Every step of your development is uploaded to the internet, which is my proposal for the energy research and development program we want to do. Well, we don't have the funding to put that together. But if I were just to be put on the advisory board for these new energy researchers, I would say that's the first thing you have to do. The problem is many of them are trying to get funding from people who want to be able to get a return on their investment. So that gets into the question of, you have to find people who are true angel investors who want to put the funds in, and they may never see a penny out. But that's very, very hard to do, because, you know, it's the golden lamb sort of thing, and that's the real problem. And I think that until we learn that lesson that the last 100 years of experience has given us collectively, we're going to keep making that same mistake. And all I can do is advise. I can't force folks to do it, and we'll see. I would like to see someone make it through that juggernaut, but I'd be very surprised if they do, using the strategies of conventional business, intellectual property, finance, and investor concepts.
I've been following your work for a lot of years, and particularly that video that you put out, where there were like 400 or some people that worked for the government, and they all stood up at the podium and they spoke. I was amazed that you put that out there. But I read an article that you had put out talking about Buzz Aldrin. He had died back in November, and you put the article out about his death and how his family couldn't speak about.
Oh, I think that was Neil Armstrong, actually.
Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, the first man to walk on the moon. Yeah.
Exactly, and you said that when he landed, he saw something that he couldn't talk about?
Yes.
So, yeah.
This is a really great question about what really happened. You know, my uncle worked for Grumman, that became Northrop Grumman, and Grumman had the contract to build the lunar module. It landed, a funny looking thing that looked like a spider. It landed on the moon in 1969 on July 20th or whatever it was. The first two men on the moon were Neil Armstrong, and after him Buzz Aldrin. Yeah. And back when we were doing these briefings for Congress, and in fact even before then, the Asilomar gathering in 1995, we reached out to Neil Armstrong, because I knew from contacts and family that when we landed on the moon, we weren't alone. Okay. And that Neil Armstrong, there were two people who've been on my team for many years who were good friends of his family. And so we reached out to him and invited him to come to those events, and he politely declined, and told us that it was made very clear to him and the other Apollo astronauts who witnessed this first event, where when we landed at the crater on the moon, the rim at the top of the crater was, quote, crowded with UFOs, the craft that were up there, multiple of them, and that these were filmed. And that I know people personally who've seen that film footage. And that's why the film footage that came back to the Earth, and we did go to the moon, but some of the footage, it doesn't make sense because the flag is moving. Now the reason for that, and this is where people say we didn't go to the moon, it was all hoax and filmed in a basement up in New York. The truth is we went, but during the lunar orbiter, going back before the Apollo mission, we actually were circling the Earth taking the first early digital photographs. And as you know from the testimony of Disclosure Project witness Carl Wolf, there were structures on the moon that were artificial. Some were newer and some were very ancient. And so they knew the covert programs, and these images were being downloaded to out here at Langley, not the CIA headquarters, Langley Air Force Base, to a compartmented operation run by the National Security Agency that was then sequestered away from the other NASA scientists. But the people running that project, the deep black people in those projects, knew that it was likely we were going to encounter something not of this world or a UFO when we landed. Therefore, they had filmed some footage that they could splice in if something started happening. So during the live transmission, if something started happening, there's a delay that went through this National Security Agency filter, and they could immediately, instantly put in. And that's why there's a couple frames where the American flag is moving. Well, there's no atmosphere on the moon, okay? Which was the one mistake they made in that whole plan. That's the telltale giveaway. Now, some people have taken that, the conspiracy theorists have said, we didn't even go to the moon. We did go to the moon. But they knew that it was likely there were going to be ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles up there. And so when they stepped out, of course, you know, and we're approaching actually, before they even landed, they saw them. So they were already with this sort of pre-prepared film that looked very, very good, except for this one error. And so Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin know for a fact. Now, Neil Armstrong said, look, you know, if I were to go forward and talk about what actually happened, I've been told, Neil Armstrong said this to us, that my wife, my children, and my grandchildren would all be killed, that they would take us out somehow, some terrible accident. And he says, I'm not going to talk about it. Now, Buzz Aldrin has just basically, he sort of had a nervous breakdown after this and was actually at an Air Force facility. I know a man that was there with him, and he confided that this is also what happened. I also know Buzz Aldrin's sister, who pulled me aside and says, yes, you're absolutely right. That is what happened, but it's not my job to out Buzz Aldrin on this. If he's ready and he's able and allowed, he will speak about it. But you have to understand, enormous pressure was put on these men never to speak about what actually happened.
Can we speculate on whether those ships came from here or from there?
And this is the follow-on question: were those ships that were around the moon at that time in 1969 extraterrestrial or man-made reproduction vehicles using anti-gravity? I don't know. It could have been either. But I think probably they weren't ours, only because those folks would not have wanted to risk exposing that they were there with cameras rolling. Okay, because that would have, of course, ended the fact that they have these secret aircraft, a secret space force.
They would watch TV and knew there was a space shuttle.
So that's one of the problems. That's, you know, I've thought about it, and the answer is I don't know, but from a logical point of view, I doubt it was ours. Okay. Now, you know, one of the things that Neil Armstrong was overheard saying, and this was reported in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, is that Neil Armstrong stated that we were essentially warned off the moon. That, in other words, these civilizations did not want us going to other moons or planets to colonize them with the consciousness of nationalism and the Cold War. Because remember, the Apollo project was really a proxy for the Cold War. The United States was in a complete panic when Sputnik overtook our space program, the Soviets. And so the race to the moon was part of, and always was part of, the military competition between two huge superpowers, the old Soviet Union and the United States of America. And so when we went there, but we went there not as a peaceful world civilization, but as a competing Cold War effort that were armed with thousands of thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, pointed at each other. That was not the consciousness that the ETs want to see us going into space with. They want us going into space with the consciousness of peace and cooperation, not militarism and war. So that's sort of your, let's say if there's an entry ticket to space exploration, that's the main one. And we haven't quite reached that point, have we? So I think that's why Neil Armstrong said, I don't know what was said or done, or what was done by these craft, but he said it made it very clear that they weren't real happy that we were going there in this way. And that's, in my opinion, why we wound down the space program to the moon. You know, my uncle was involved with this, and there was all kinds of plans to put colonies there and buildings and have, you know, people living in sort of like domes like they have out at the biosphere in Arizona and what have you, and all that was shut down. Now, the excuse they gave was budgetary cuts, but I don't think it was budgetary cuts. I think it was because, you know, it was quite clear that we were going out there immaturely as a warring civilization and not as a peaceful world civilization, which is the requirement. Yes, ma'am.
But Kennedy had talked to the Soviets about going jointly. Was that a peaceful thing together, or what prompted him? What did he know, or what was behind his question? Because he took a lot of flack.
Yeah, Kennedy did want to do an international, from the beginning, space program. And, you know, when he was assassinated, Khrushchev wept and stated, now we will not have world peace. Because Kennedy, and actually Bobby Kennedy said this, Bobby Kennedy Jr., who I've met, said this recently on a CNN interview, is that his intent was, in his second term, to get completely out of Vietnam, to do a cooperative, and to make total peace with the Soviet Union. Now, of course, there goes $1 trillion in military industrial intelligence spending. And they were not happy about that. He was also going to disclose this UFO issue. And I think there are a number of reasons why, you know, he was just not willing to succumb to their view of how the world needed to progress with endless conflict. And that's why there was no second term of Jack Kennedy, in my opinion. Now, from what I know, and this is also somewhat corroborated, although in a bit of a titillating way, with the document I got from the National Security Agency contact I have. That's the Marilyn Monroe document. And in the Marilyn Monroe document, it's a top secret document that was handed off to me, never declassified, authenticated by a man who used to be General Odom, ODOM's right-hand guy, who was National Security Agency head for years. And in this document, it was a wiretap summary that the CIA wiretapping a bunch of people, but mainly Marilyn Monroe, who, as you know, had an affair with Jack Kennedy and also with Bobby Kennedy. And they knew it was coming too public, and so in 1962, or whenever it was, they cut that off. And she was furious, so she was calling up Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, and an art dealer named Rothberg in New York, and other people, saying that she was going to hold a news conference to tell Jack Kennedy, to tell the world what Jack Kennedy had told her about, quote, objects from outer space that were recovered in New Mexico in the 40s, clear reference to Roswell, as well as some other matters. That wiretap summary is dated the day before they found her dead. Now, when I brought this up to, there was a famous actor and singer named Burl Ives, who used to be on our executive committee, and he was friends with Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. And Burl Ives, when I showed this document to him, he says, he just held his head. He says, we all know Marilyn was killed and that it wasn't an overdose. We didn't know why. And he was a 33rd degree Mason. Burl Ives was. He has a room in this building next door, the big 33rd degree Masonic temple next door. And I said, yeah, well, Marilyn didn't know what kind of big toes and big gorillas she was stepping on. But of course, the whole world would have covered that press conference. It would have been sensational. And so Marilyn Monroe almost certainly was assassinated because she was going way too far off the reservation. And this document has the proper project code names and code numbers for that era. Project Moondust, Project 46, some of these key project code names and code numbers for the early 60s. I have that document. It's in my first book. It's there for anyone to read. It's explosive, and it's dispositive, actually. But unfortunately for Marilyn Monroe, you know, she didn't realize that this was non-trivial. This is not a trivial thing to hold a press conference, a person of her stardom in that era. I mean, she was huge, talking about these specific issues because she had learned that apparently in pillow talk with Jack Kennedy. And so it cost her life in order to keep that quiet.
Well, I was wondering, the organization, this invisible organization that more or less runs the whole thing, if you were going to put a face on it or an organization, do they hold regular meetings or how do they operate? They have to do some kind of thing right now.
Very good question he's asking. You know, this group, Magic Control, the Majority Committee, Joint Intelligence Committee is what it is called. That's where MAGIC comes from, M-A-J-I-C. They do have meetings. It's actually transnational. There are people from other countries involved with it, not just U.S. Always has been transnational. The U.S. is key because it's the economic and technological powerhouse, but Great Britain is also very important in all this. And you know, there are various people who have been on the senior committee, such as Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. I know for a fact he was the head of the National Security Agency. Prior to that, he was Deputy Director CIA, and then he became a board member of Science Applications International Corporation. So I know a number of the people. I've met with some of the people who are on this group, including people who are deep cover in the CIA and elsewhere. And former members of Congress and other SAIC executives I've met with. But, you know, it's also very compartmented. So in other words, you may have 200 or 300 people in this group that are the sort of committee, but even within that, it's a pyramid, and there's compartments within it. Not all of them know everything going on. It's not like it's an all-access pass. And some have gone rogue, splintered off and kind of gone rogue, even within the rogues of the rogue, if you get my drift, which is why it's so dangerous. You know, I could draw a whole diagram of it, but you can kind of imagine some of the key people. You know, more recently, General Michael Hayden has been involved with that committee, who had been NSA head and CIA director. So some of these people are known in the public, most aren't. And what I would say is that a lot of the folks who are in the corporate contracting world, what's called WFO, work for others, contracting are key to this. I remember years ago, right before I was going to have the meeting with the Clinton CIA director, I was in Arizona at the Wrigley Mansion, the Wrigley chewing gum people, but it had been bought by Jordy Hormel of the Hormel Meat Company. And there was a man who was a member of this MAGIC, this MJ-12, they used to call it, group. And he asked me to come to the mansion late at night, 10, 11 o'clock at night. I went there, and it was Jordy Hormel was nowhere around. They were just using the facility. And this was a high-tech digital guy, and who actually moves around in the UFO subculture. And we were at this table. It looked like a big conference table, and all these suits were there and people. And they were basically, you know, telling me that I was barking up the wrong tree, meeting with the CIA director. And this man pulled me aside, and he said to me, the CIA director and president doesn't know about this, and they're not going to know anything about it. If you want to know about what's really going on, come talk to people like us. And it was a whole room full of folks like that. Spooky. And then it was interesting because, you know, a couple years before, the former head of Army intelligence had offered me $2 billion if I would stop doing what I was doing, close my operation, and join his group. He had a $2 billion slush fund out of Eastern Europe. And I said, no, thank you. And that was when $1 billion was a lot of money. And when I refused, and he went to my wife, tried to convince my wife that I should do this. But this was 2 years later, and this guy said, you know what? This is how they operate. We checked you out. You're a doctor. You have really good credit. Take out all the credit cards you want, and you can run all your operations, max them out each month. Because my group, we run the supercomputers that back up the global financial system, and we'll just zero them out every month. That's what he offered. We'll just zero all your credit cards out every month. I said, well, that's very nice of you, Jim, to offer that, but then you would own me, wouldn't you? Because you would have a record. And I said, I'm afraid I can't. He says, no, we're just trying to help you out. You see how this works. That was in 1994, 93, and then 94. So they, I've, over the years had multiple of these sort of approaches, which is quite bizarre. And you couldn't make this stuff up. If you put it in a movie, people would think it was fictitious. But it is how they operate. So the corporate and contracting end is really a lot of where the action is with these large corporations and their compartmented groups. And then within certain agencies, there are select folks who are on this committee. So it's not all one thing, but they do have meetings, and it's evolved over the years. My understanding, I was told this some years ago, that about 70% of that group favors what I'm proposing. But the other 30% who are the really violent ones are opposed. And they don't mind killing one of their own, like Bill Colby. Bill Colby was in this group. He defected, but he did it alone. And he was going to make a run at the crown jewel of what they were keeping secret, and that's the energy technologies. And that, as I mentioned, that week they found him floating down the Potomac River. So, and I think that was in 95 or 96, but, I think this is why, I have had some very tragic things happen in my life, if you read between the lines, and that's why I decided I had to find other ways of doing this where we don't increase this body count. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. First thing, sorry about my terrible accent.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so this is an important and personal question for you. How the ET choose you and how they decide you are the right person for making contact. And if that happened and they contact you after that, what to do?
She's asking how the ETs choose, not me, but you, a person in general, to make contact. I think that there's a saying that's been, I think, inappropriately translated. Many are called, but few are chosen. I think it really is supposed to say, many are called, but few choose to answer the call. And so I think that there have been knocking on our front door and our back door and our side door for a very long time, these civilizations. What they're waiting for are people who will approach them without fear and prejudice, without violence, who understand a little bit of their reality, who will educate themselves a little bit about what it means to be interstellar. And to be interstellar means to be in an extraordinarily high state of consciousness, personally, but also your technologies are interfacing with consciousness. And so that's why, you know, if you approach it with an ethical and moral intent of a pure heart, peaceful purpose, no fear, no prejudice, but also have prepared yourself for, shall we say, the unusual, even strange or bizarre ways that they may interface with you, so you're not afraid when they do, then they will. But they expect a certain level of you being educated and prepared. And then they will. And I don't think it's, you know, I've always said, I don't think I'm special. I don't think anyone is disabled from being able to make contact. I think it's them willing to go through the process of training and education, but more importantly, what is the purity of your heart and intent? You know, it can't just be because you want to see a UFO and be entertained, like dolphins at SeaWorld. It has to be for a sincere purpose to be a liaison between humanity and their culture. And if there's that purity of intent, then I think you'll be astonished. But there's also the preparation that has to happen. The reason for that is, if you read the last book that we put out about extraterrestrial, the Countdown to Transformation, extraterrestrial contact, Countdown to Transformation, and you read the accounts our senior team has had going around the world, some of it's very strange stuff. Like we have a team up in New York where there are these two wonderful ladies, and Diane and her wife, Marilyn, when they first read my book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, had their cell phone accessed when, I forget which one, was at the dentist office. And all of a sudden, this sphere appeared on her phone, and the C-SETI tones, those tones we use, started playing over the speaker system of the entire dentist office and over her phone. And this happened multiple times until she came to the Outer Banks of North Carolina and got trained and just had amazing contact. But it was very strange stuff. And in fact, the dentist came out and said, "What's that weird music?" And it sounds like something from outer space. And it was all coming through. I think it was Marilyn's phone. I'm not sure. Or Diane's. It was Diane, yeah. So there's all kinds of ways where they will sort of initiate you and test you to see if you're ready for. Most people live in a very 3D, almost teleologic, very in a box world. But if you're interstellar, you're not living in that world. You're living in the world of higher dimensions, higher consciousness, energy fields that are completely beyond the speed of light. And so when those come into 3D, it can be very unusual. And so preparing yourself for contact involves understanding where mind and consciousness and thought and electromagnetic systems and all this phenomenon come together. There's a nexus where they come together. And that's why the development of higher states of consciousness and the meditative state is the foundation of the whole Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. It's very controversial amongst the nuts and bolts crowd in the UFO subculture. I said, yes, but you're not dealing with civilizations using a piece of junk like this. They're not communicating using the speed of light. Because if they're from the Andromeda Galaxy, which one of the ETs that came at Joshua Tree told us he was from the Andromeda Galaxy. And we have a photo of it. It's on our website. Go look at it. This is 2.5 million light years from Earth. At the speed of light, it would take 5 million years to get a signal from there to here and back. 5 million years. Homo sapiens haven't been on Earth for 5 million years. So now that means that they're using technologies that are transdimensional, going beyond the speed of light, and which also, it so happens, interface with thought forms, energy fields that are in the realm of the thought. What used to be relegated to the mystics, but now is something we have to accept as the real science of the future. And so this is where the science of consciousness and the science of transdimensional and interstellar technologies are going to have to come together, which is actually my first great love. This is actually what got me involved in all this, because before I was a medical doctor, I'd had a near-death experience, and I had this, even though I was raised an atheist, I had this experience of the unbounded being, and it was beautiful. It was a God consciousness experience, for lack of a better word. And I realized that the mind, the consciousness within every single person is infinite, and everything is folded within it. So I began to learn meditation and became a meditation teacher. I was a meditation teacher before I was an emergency doctor. And what I learned was that this became key, and that's why right after, 6 months after that near-death experience, I had this amazing contact experience that I recount in Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge. But I think that it makes total sense, and it's the sort of thing nobody really wants to talk about in polite circles scientifically, because it sounds too weird. But if it's not a little weird, it's not extraterrestrial. It's probably something from Lockheed. And so educating yourself about the nature of where consciousness and thought and these technologies interface with their technologies. And in 1991, I wrote a paper that's in the first book I wrote that's called The Comprehensive Assessment of the UFO ETI, Extraterrestrial Intelligence Subject. And in it, I talk about technology-assisted consciousness and consciousness-assisted technologies, where the mind interfaces with these both ways, where the mind can interface with technology, but also where technologies can augment and project thought and awareness more accurately. And that's what these civilizations had. I got a call from a senior aerospace engineer at McDonnell Douglas Aerospace that became part of Boeing Phantom Works. They had their own Phantom Works, became part of Boeing covert programs, but it was still McDonnell Douglas back then. And he said, "How do you know this? This is the most accurate assessment any of us have ever read." And it turns out he had been on all kinds of committees, had known old man McDonald at McDonnell Douglas, and was on the Condon Committee to look into this at the University of Colorado in 1969. But he said that it's going to get you in a lot of trouble because it sounds a little far out there. And then he related me a story. He says, I was researching a case for McDonnell Douglas years ago, and it was in the Baja California in Mexico. And a craft had materialized, and this ET just appeared outside of it. And he had sort of a little black box, or rectangular box here at his solar plexus. And the person who had the encounter said that as clear as you would hear words in your ears, this being was communicating with his mind. And he was thinking back, and he knows that this device was receiving it and augmenting it and facilitating it. And it was going back and forth, all through thought. And he said that was a very, very solid case. He interviewed the people directly. And I said, well, that doesn't surprise me. I said, how else are you going to communicate interstellar? You have to go at the speed of thought, not the speed of electromagnetic signals. Now, this, of course, opens you up into the ridicule of the tinfoil hat crowd. But there is a serious science. And by the way, it is why the people at the science director at the CIA and other places know that we're onto the real thing. I had an NSA guy come up to me and said, they're very mad at you because you figured out the Rosetta Stone of contact. And it involves consciousness and thought, transdimensional physics. But it is also the thing that gets you in the most trouble the most quickly in the conventional world, mainly because the conventional world has been miseducated about science, technology, consciousness, religion, thought, everything. I mean, it's almost like everything you know is wrong. But or partially wrong, but that's where you get the preparation, is really in developing your state of consciousness and having this intent. And then you just go out there and put yourself at service. And if you say, I'll be at service to doing this, almost anything is possible.
What are your thoughts on crop circles? And do you have certain messages you think that they're trying to send through these?
Great question about crop circles. And by the way, just hold Colin Andrews in your thoughts and prayers. I got an email late last night that He is in critical condition and is at Yale University Hospital with a type of heart condition, and he is in really critical condition. He's the premier crop circle researcher. He's a really good friend since 92, 91. So, you know, I was shocked to hear this last night. But I would say that, you know, the majority of crop circles at this point are hoaxed. However, the ones that have been authentic are really amazing. The problem is sifting out the noise from the sound. It's just like UFOs. You know, what part of it's man-made and disinformation and hoaxed, and what part of it is real. But my own sense of it is that it's certainly a way that they're trying to visually convey almost archetype knowledge of symbols and shapes and, if you will, sacred geometry through a very visual medium, transdimensionally. And the way I think they're created, because we interviewed, Colin Andrews and I interviewed a farmer, believe it or not, his name was Mr. Bull. It's like, you can't make that up either, near Alton Barnes. And he had been out on his farm in daytime, and there had been a crop circle that had formed, and then he was there when this energy field just came out of the sky, and it was like a dark, it was like a mobile black hole. And it came down, and all of a sudden, everything started swirling and moving and bending down around it. And what I figured out by studying the real crop circles, and you know, the CSETI logo is a crop circle that we communicated visually to the ETs that they put into a field in 1992. And that whole story is a fascinating story. But what I figured out is that what they're doing is that they're augmenting or increasing the gravitational field over a certain area, over with a template, if you will, like a cutout, like a blueprint, electromagnetic blueprint, that then goes and lays this down very quickly. Now, the ones that are hoaxed are just smushed down, but these are very fascinating. And so if you can imagine creating a counter-rotating electromagnetic field that causes levitation, which is what anti-gravity is, in a certain resonant frequency, using crystalline materials and nanocrystalline materials. I mean, we know exactly how this works. But then reverse that. You're increasing the gravitational field, so you can have an object way out in space, and it kind of targets an area very specifically and can create this energy field that then pulls the crop down instead of lifting it up, but in a very specific pattern. It goes very quickly. And that's how we figured out how they're making it, how they're making the authentic crop circles. Yes?
Are we finished? Have you heard of the Kesh Foundation and any of his work?
Yes, I've heard of them. We've corresponded, and we've asked for, you know, evidence of proof of principal operation and never gotten anything. So we're still waiting to see if they have anything. It's easy to make a claim. Our requirement, as you know, for these energy technologies is transparent conveyance of them to us with transparent testing, but more importantly, third-party creation of the effect, which is the sine qua non of science. If it's not reproducible, it's not science. It has to be reproducible. And so that's what we've asked for, but we haven't gotten anything in response yet. So, yes, sir.
You spoke about how difficult it would be for a craft to come down without getting shut down, that there are so many things in place that as soon as they would show up, somebody's there right away.
Is there a question? Oh, yes. Well, he's asking about, you know, this whole issue of when you're, you know, setting up a CE5 or wanting to invite ETs to come into an area, you know, what kind of things might interfere. And the problem is that in the last 60 years, we've gone from, or 70 years since Roswell, we've gone from fairly primitive electromagnetic targeting to very sophisticated ones that are space-based and on aircraft. And these have been used. Now, we were at Mount Shasta a few years ago when we were doing CE5, and there was this really not fully materialized craft. It was like a sphere of pure white energy, light, visible. Everyone saw, 30 people, 40 people. And it was floating towards us out of Mount Shasta, about 12,000 feet elevation. And we were at about 7,000, so probably about 5,000 AGL, above ground level. And it was coming towards us. And there was a very high altitude, it seemed like it was a 747, especially equipped, and a burst of energy came out of this aircraft. And at that instant, this partially in this dimension craft vanished, and this energy field, it was invisible, but came in about 200 yards in front of us into the woods and crashed through the woods, ripping the tree limbs off in the trees, and actually impacted the earth and went boom, and then boom, boom, boom. It, for 15 seconds, shook the earth. And I thought we were expecting to see a mushroom cloud. Nothing. It was just a directed energy weapon. And that was one of the few times where I was really scared for my group. And I thought, my God, we're all going to get killed. And everyone there saw this. And that's when, you know, a few things like that happen, and that's why one of our protocols is to always let the ETs know, don't do anything too risky, because we don't want you or us to get caught in the crossfire. This is why we initially started these briefings with the military, to ask that we have them deconflict their operations with ours, but they didn't listen, because the operations that want to interfere. Now, why would that happen? They don't want CE5 events to go so far that it results in a massive, open, dispositive event that can't be ambiguous. And that's why it tends to be quick, strange. Now, can that change? Yes, perhaps. But people have asked me, why don't you go to the Amazon? Or I don't think it matters, because the weapon systems I've been briefed on are geospatial. They can be moved, and there can be on what look like satellites or aircraft that can be anywhere in the world. So I think that that's why, as the head of this, I mean, there are thousands of people doing the CE5 initiative. I always tell people the biggest liability is if I'm there. So do it without me. Because they don't have enough assets to keep track of thousands of teams, but they can keep track of where I am. So, but when this happened, it made me realize that they had some new things that were quite amazing. But luckily, this particular ET object wasn't fully in this dimension. It was almost like a plasma energy that was floating towards us from way up in Mount Shasta, came out of the mountain. And we have actually some great videotapes of those objects coming out of the mountain, but this one was actually coming towards us when this object fired. And so that's why I always ask the ETs, you know, come, but don't do anything that is too risky for you or us. Do it only if it's safe and appropriate for this time and place. And, you know, I don't think that this is a huge problem for local contact teams that have 4 or 5 people scattered around, because, I mean, this group is large, but it's not omniscient and omnipresent. But when I'm doing something and it's obviously been announced and we're there with a whole group of trainees, it's certainly going to be monitored. So that's why I tell people that it's great as a training event. We have amazing sightings and events happen. But, I mean, the good news is I'm there. The bad news is I'm there. I mean, being quite honest with you. Yes, sir.
And how would you, the contacts that you have, the communications that you have, how would you characterize them? Do they break down into, do you communicate about the same things or the same general things each time, or is it just all over the place?
He's asking, you know, how the communications kind of break down into different types of communications and information. It actually is different with every group. And every time we go out, there's something new that happens I've never seen. And I've been doing this for 25 years. So if you read the book, Extraterrestrial Contact, Countdown to Transformation, what you'll see in that book is that there are literally thousands of different phenomena that happen and have happened over the years. And it runs the gamut to fully materialized objects that appear right over us, and people getting remote viewed information consciously, to we were sitting one time out in Orange County, and sitting right in front of all of us, I was doing just a weekend thing, there was a voice that started talking right in front of us in thin air.
Is there a consistent message, though?
It depends on the group. And the message, obviously, is that they're very happy we're doing this, and it's always a welcoming sort of a feeling. But sometimes there is very specific information, and it just depends on the setting. When this ET I call Bijou, who appeared at Joshua Tree, the one that looks like this luminous figure floating outside the circle, it was a very specific welcome from a group of people. Now, the way that was preceded was that we were in our circle up in the Joshua Tree National Park, and we were at a break, and I'd walked out east of the circle out into the desert, and I was with a group of people on my team, and suddenly there was like a sphere that fully materialized right beside me and walked with me. And I said, oh, they're here. So we went back to the group to get people back together, because they were all scattered. There's 30, 40 people in the desert, and it's pitch black. And all of a sudden, we hear a group of 4 or 5 ETs talking. And they're outside the circle to the southeast. And we could hear mostly, it sounded like female voices except for one. I heard a male voice. And by the way, almost everyone heard this. And I have these really good night vision binoculars, like generation advanced. And there was nothing there where you heard these people talking. So I turned to everyone, I said, we need to get back together in coherence and sit down. And I asked someone to take a picture. So Raven, a member of my team, was just holding her breath, but she didn't have a tripod, and took a picture, 3 or 4 second exposure, and in it is this being floating right outside our circle, turned and waving. It's not Photoshopped. That is the single most important picture in the history of the UFO subject, because it was a CE5 diplomatic initiative that ended up having photographic proof of it, our contact team. So it's been roundly missed by most people. It is the single most important piece of evidence in the last 100 years that I know of. So anyway, it was beautiful. And then we went into this meditative state, and there were all kinds of information that we started getting. All our electronic, we have these magnetometers, magnetic field meters, and radar detectors and other high-tech stuff all started talking. And it went on for about 2 hours. It was amazing. And so figuring out what they're actually communicating is an art of, someone would say, is it telepathic? I said, no, it's sensing. So you go into a deep state, and you can actually get specific information about where they're from, why they're there. But it's very different each time. You know, we're going to be up in Joshua Tree in a couple weeks, and then in the Rocky Mountains in June. And we may do something in Portugal, you know, this fall, and some other things this summer. I don't know. But I'd like to go to Portugal and do it. We'll see. We're looking for a good place to do it. But yeah, it's a beautiful experience. And what I tell people is that, you know, it's almost universally where they're wanting to do sort of a cultural exchange. They're wanting to see how you are. And then a lot of times they will show you visually their planet or their houses or their culture. It's really quite beautiful. You know, people who have never had experiences like that will have these breakthrough events, and it just blows their minds. The other thing is that sound can also be seen at a certain resonant frequency. So one time we were up at Mount Shasta, a different time, and we were sitting in the National Forest, and there was a tone that came out of, it was a multi-directional tone that just emerged out of the air. And everyone, we were in our meditative state, and everyone saw what looked like a gunmetal gray or pearlish gray sphere that moved through the circle like a string of pearls. So the sound created the form, which is very Vedic if you understand the Vedas, name and form, sound and form. And that was definitely ET. And it was astonishing because almost everyone sitting there heard and saw in their visual image the same object move through. Beautiful.
When I was watching the testimony from the National Press Club, there were witnesses that mentioned seeing objects on radar moving at very high speeds and at right angles,
Right.
which to me means that they must be dematerialized if they had any life forms on board. Otherwise, they would have been smoothed by the momentum of the right angle. Does that have any implications in terms of like the soul that might be in a person? Because how can a being dematerialize and then come back?
Well, he's asking a question about objects that are moving like at 100,000 miles an hour or 20,000 miles an hour, make a right turn. Actually, they do not have to be dematerialized. What they do is that they can create, if you will, an energy field around the craft that is kind of like control for one gravity. And so even if and it moves with the object. So this is field propulsion, all right? So it can be moving at 100,000 or 200,000 miles an hour and stop or make a right-hand turn. Now, if you were in a jet aircraft, your brains would be coming out of your nose, literally. I mean, it would kill you. But if you have the ability to control what's called gravity control and mass control, and remember, it's a misnomer to say anti-gravity. It's actually, if you will, a mass attenuation, the reduction of mass. So using certain resonant frequencies electromagnetically, you can cause an object to become lighter and then completely massless. Now, at the point that it's massless, it's out of this dimension. But it can be 99% massless, and you will see some aspect of it. You see what I'm saying? And this has to do with spin theory in physics and altering the angular momentum of the atoms and subatomic particles. I'm not going to go into the arcana of this because people will be bored. But we understand how this works. But basically the whole craft and everyone on it is, and around this object, is a field that's created. So that's how it can move. And they can still be fully materialized and move. Now, it may also be that they're not materialized and all you're seeing is sort of a energy form or a plasma effect. Such as when Stoney Campbell, who was an Air Force security officer at the Air Force Base in Oklahoma back in the 60s, and there was a cobalt blue sort of a chevron or triangular craft that came over the hot nuclear armed aircraft that we had there. And he and the other security guards could see it, but it wasn't solid. It literally could go straight through the aircraft. But it was enough in this dimension that it set off all the alarms. So all the pilots had to go into the hot area and take off. This is in the disclosure book and in the material. So, but in that case, they were like, what are we seeing? It was almost like an apparition. Because what they were doing, they were checking out our nuclear weapons, but in a form that wasn't fully solid. And to understand that, you have to begin to understand how you can sort of change mass to where it crosses over into just energy, pure energy, which all mass really is pure energy, but that's all that's left and represented, and then tweak it a little more, and it's invisible. It's still there, and all you may do is pick up an electromagnetic signal, which is why learning how to make contact and how the phenomenon comes, it's really useful to come on one of these expeditions that I run.
Do you know if it's a semi-transitional thing that we're seeing, like maybe it's semi-transdimensional versus dematerialized? Like, how do we know which really is what's happening when you see just that glow, but it may not be there? We just see the light that's being emitted from the object, but right. Maybe it's not physical. Is it dematerialized, or is it like transitioning between dimensions? Do we know?
Yes, we do know. He's asking, how do you know if it's dematerialized? If it's really completely out of this dimension, you're not going to see it. You may remote view it, and there may be an electromagnetic field effect, but visually you're not going to see it. Remember, your eyes only see a very limited spectrum. If you are seeing it, and it may be only transiently, it may only be like a heat wave effect, and you see this thing shimmering, and it comes in and out of this dimension. What it's doing, it's phasing in and out. And it can, at that point, fully materialize in an instant, fully dematerialize in an instant. And this is actually what Corso described. It wasn't in his book, but I mean, I saw it in his papers when I went to his house. had a stack of papers this big. And Colonel Corso had this encounter at White Sands where this craft materialized in broad daylight, and then it would dematerialize. And when it was dematerialized, there was just, it looked like a heat wave, you know, like a mirage in the desert, and then in the shape of the ship. And then it would go click and be fully materialized back. And it did this back and forth, showing him.
All within the same dimension does it do this, or is it transitioning between dimensions as it does it?
And that's what I'm saying. It's going from 3D into other D.
Got it.
Okay. But, you know, it's like a radio waves. If you imagine, you know, the old tuners where you can turn, and sometimes you will hear 2 stations at once on the old AM radio dials, like, you know, where you turn. They can sometimes be in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But that, you know, this is a really advanced discussion of the technologies. But, you know, yes, we do understand how they do it, and classified programs have also experimented with doing the same thing. We have time for probably, what time do you guys have? 5:58. We have 2 minutes before we're supposed to take a break. Is that right? Yeah. So let's see. I'll take someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Yes, sir.
I think it was in Countdown to Transformation that you would relate the story about how you met the ET you needed kindness.
Yeah.
And I believe you were introduced to her by Shari.
Yeah. The night Sherry Adamak passed away is when I was introduced to this ET I call kindness. Yes.
So my question is, do you continue to have encounters with kindness and with Shari? And also, is it common to encounter people who have passed away when you have encounters with ETs?
Yes, is it common to have encounters with people who are passed away also when you're having encounters with ETs? I don't know if it's common, but it does happen. And remember, if you go beyond the speed of light, what I call the crossing point of light, you go into energy fields that begin to approximate what the mystics used to call the astral, which is closely approximated to, if you will, the afterlife, that astral aspect of your body. So the night that Sherry Adamak passed away, I awakened in this lucid state, and she was there introducing me to this ET with a perfectly round head. I mean, exactly round, not elongated at all, and completely hairless, and very, very kind. I call her kindness because she just emitted this kindness. And in almost every expedition under the stars we've had since 1998, she has shown up in what looks like sometimes it's cobalt blue and sometimes it's diamond blue-white ship. And often it'll come in and make a curve and then go back out and dematerialize. But it's that distinctive, it's very distinctive. So yes, we have. And my understanding is that she's a very senior diplomat with an interstellar coalition, very enlightened. And it's sort of like the Bijou, when we had this experience in Joshua Tree. The amount of just the development of consciousness of these life forms that have explored the cosmos for thousands, some of them millions of years, it's just stunning. And the intelligence. So yeah, that continues to happen. And it's very unusual that we're out on one of these week expeditions where we don't see that ship.
Do you ever see Shari anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have dreams with her. Yeah. And by the way, the lucid dream is an amazing tool because it's, buried within everyone is everything. The entire, it's like this old saying from the Sufi, I think it's Sufi tradition, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. In other words, it's a rhetorical question. You're not just some little thing. Through the structure of consciousness and mind, the entire cosmos is folded within every single person, like a quantum conscious hologram. So we're all conscious quantum holograms, and the entirety of the cosmos and creation is folded within every single one of us. So that's why you can have a lucid dream or be in a meditative state and see other worlds and see other places or even other dimensions where people have passed on. And it's quite beautiful. Now, trying to prove that scientifically, but it's a global experience. I mean, there's so many people who've had lucid dreams of something that's happened the next day. I mean, so there's empirical evidence, but you can't prove it. But ultimately, I think in the future we will have the ability technologically to prove these things. And until then, we can use, what God gave us, our own consciousness and thought and mind, and create a new world. Well, with that, I think it's a great place to end. It's a little after 6. I want to thank all of you for coming. We'll have time to hang here for a little while. And I just want to say in closing, really the key thing to disclosure and to contact is people stepping into their own power and not waiting for other people to do it. Because if you wait for others to do it, it will never happen. This is something that has to be a grassroots, mass consciousness event. And the next phase of disclosure is going to be exactly that. And the more that people understand that and actually do it, instead of just thinking about it, the more rapidly we're going to get to this next level of our civilization, the future of which is beautiful if we get it right. Because it's a future of free energy, abundance and unbelievable prosperity on this planet, peace, universal peace, and interstellar travel. That is what, we're right at the point of being able to create that reality. And that is the future for Earth and humanity if we choose to make it that. But it isn't going to happen by people sitting doing nothing. It's going to happen because you actually, kind of walk that talk and make it happen. And so empowerment of yourself and learning to do this, and also helping us identify the people who can be this next wave of disclosure witnesses. But just by sharing the disclosure book and the videos of what we've already put together with people will come up to you and say, oh, well, I know someone who was in the Navy, who was on a ship that had this, or someone who's worked for Lockheed Martin at the Cube in Edwards. We need to get a whole new wave of people to come forward that will just end forever the question of the secrecy. But that's only the beginning of the work. Because the real work is then after that, where we have to find a way of creating a world on this planet that is worthy of becoming part of an interstellar family of planets, which means a peaceful civilization. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here, and stay in touch.